So I thank you for everybody showing up. I'm gonna thank our sponsors. Kaylee can kind of have a script here, so hopefully it makes everything move a little quicker. So if Kaylee can run slideshow for sponsors. And thank you for Foster's, Brett Young, and DLF for putting. We got a pretty good gift certificate going on. Snap-on gift certificate. I'm going to have to say, I'm allowed to say this, that you have to stay to the end of the meeting for the draw and be here to get it. That way it forces everybody and the members to actually stay at the AGM. Nice part about an AGM is it really gives input to our board directors from the membership. So that's a great thing. I'll introduce Kaylee. Hopefully I said that right. Sorry, Kaylee. I had to phone to Alan yesterday and say, who's this Kaylee girl? Kaylee Haley's from Vulcan, Alberta, and she farms with her husband on a family farm. She worked with all her speakers to get the presentations done. Most of them are recorded. Well, I think they're all recorded. The presenters will be here at the end of their pre-recorded meeting for any questions. It just makes things go a lot quicker, easier, and on time. So Kaylee is our technician for keeping this going, and hopefully I'm pretty confident it'll go as good as probably as good as what it did last year. So thanks again, Haley, and I'll leave you do some Zoom tips and housekeeping.
So much for having me. So as Danny said, my name is Kaylee. I will be in the background for today's presentations and the AGM. Just one thing to note, you will notice that your default setting is that your video and your audio are off. We're going to ask that they remain off unless prompted. As you know, rural internet can be a bit of a handful sometimes, and we want to make sure we minimize bandwidth load. And this will also make sure that the focus remains on the presentations and on the speakers, especially during their presentation videos. There will be a chance to ask questions and comments and so on, and we will lift the restrictions for that point. You will be still able to interact with the speakers during their presentation. So if you haven't found it already, there is the chat function. So bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see right in the middle of that taskbar, you'll see a little chat button. Click that, feel free to enter in a message just like I just did. And that's where you can put questions in, comments for speakers during the presentation, and then they'll address them after. That's also where, once we get into the AGM portion, you'll be able to interact that way as well. You'll also be able to participate during that AGM with questions and so on when we prompt you to turn your microphone on. You'll see a little pop-up that pops up on your screen. Today's session is recorded. We're recording everything, and then we will have that available for anyone who has to step out or gets disconnected, you have to take a phone call, anything like that. I know Talon over at Talon and Susie will be making that available to everyone. There will be a Q&A at the end of each presentation where you can ask the speakers questions about their presentation. So keep those questions in queue for that. You can use the raise hand function. So again, bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see the chat button. Just to the right of that, you'll see a raise hand. If you click that, you can see in my screen, it has a little hand in the corner. That just lets us know, hey, I want to turn my microphone on and ask the speaker a question. So that's the one function you can use that for. You can also use the participants button. I know one part of the AGM is making sure we know who all is in the room. So when you click the participants button, just to the left of the chat, it'll bring up a list of everyone who's in the room. Your name should be close to or at the top of that list. It'll say me next to it. Just double check that that is your correct name. I know we've had that a couple things happen with that already this morning. So if it's not your right name, you can rename yourself by putting your mouse over top of your name, click more. It might be 3 dots if you're on a Mac, and then you'll see rename. If you too many instructions, not quite sure how to find that, pop your name in the chat and I'll rename it for you. If you are experiencing any technical issues, as I mentioned, I will be in the background. So you can always reach out to either myself or Talon Gauthier, who is also on the call, and either one of us will be happy to help you out. And you can do that by opening up the chat and then selecting, you'll see in the chat, you'll see two, you'll see everyone. And if you click everyone, it's a little drop-down menu. And right at the top of the list should be my name, Keely Healy, and then you'll be also able to find Talon on that list. And if you click one of our names, you'll see a direct message in red next to it. This means you can direct message us and just go, hey, I can't hear, I can't see, something's happening, and we'll be able to help you out that way. If you get disconnected, feel free to jump right back in. We'll reconnect you. I know sometimes internet issues happen, so we'll get you right back in the room. You can just rejoin through that link in your email. And again, if you're having reoccurring internet issues, we're going to have this recording available for everyone. One last thing, speakers will be live in the chat during their presentations, so they will be happy to answer any brief questions. So if you have a quick one-off, you pop it in the chat, they'll probably get right back to you in that chat. Longer questions, we're going to save for those Q&A sessions after each presentation. On that note, I am going to turn it back to Danny. Thank you so much.
Perfect. I see we got some really good representation right across Canada. Thanks for joining us. Leonard McCalder is all the way from PI. He's a potato farmer and grass seed grower, so it's kind of nice to see the east all the way to the west here. That's awesome. I'm going to give this to Calvin. We'll be chairing I guess you call it a seminar before the AGM. I'll leave Calvin do the rest of this till, I believe it is 11 o'clock when we do start our AGM, and I'll be back on. So have fun there, Calvin. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Danny. So I think most of everybody's probably familiar with almost all of our speakers this morning. So we'll have a market update in them here in the next few minutes, and then we'll get some of the staff from the research station at Beaverlodge to give some updates on some forward seed research work that they're doing. Our first session, though, is on get an overview of kind of where markets are at, where forward seed markets are at. It's always a tough thing to find speakers to do this, so we always appreciate when some of the seed trade reps step up and put their talks together and present it to us. So we always appreciate what they do for us and giving us this updates. So the first one this morning, again, most of you are going to be pretty familiar with Doug. Doug Thiessen is the general manager with Foster Seed and Feed out of Beaverlodge. And once again, Talon was able to line up Doug to give a bit of an overview of the turf and grass seed, or turf grass market update. So I'll pass it over to Doug.
The following is my turf grass marketing report for the 2021 crop year and going into the 2022 crop year. Now, to start with, the heat dome of June 2021 set the story for the turf grass industry for the past 8 months. The heat dome caused a yield reduction of about 2/3 in our creeping red fescue crop in 2021 in the piece. The heat dome not only covered the piece, but affected most of Western North America in the same way. It resulted in declines of almost all turf grass species. Perennial ryegrass and tall fescue in Oregon, Kentucky bluegrass in Washington and Idaho, and perennial ryegrass in Manitoba and Minnesota all suffered similar declines. As a result, we are experiencing shortages in all turf grass species, which to my knowledge has never occurred before. Turf grass production in North America is over a wide geographical area, and usually a decline in production on one species or another is offset by good yields in another geographical area or from another species. With the 2021 crop, we were short of all species, and as a result have seen prices that I have not seen before. This shortage of seed as well comes on the heels of excellent sales in the springs of 2020 and the spring of 2021. The cocooning effect of the COVID lockdowns have been a super boost for all the backyard ventures, including the turfgrass industry. Salespeople, who by natural selection are an optimistic sort, always believe that sales will improve year over year. Usually, we forecast a 5% increase from one year to another. This decrease of 50% in supply was not in our calculations. As a result, demand has far outstripped supply, and we've seen prices skyrocket. I've talked a number of times about the effect that coating has on the demand of turfgrass seed. During the years previous to 2021, we were finally seeing the constant increase in the amount of coating start to slow. A couple of reasons for this. One being that the customer appreciates a more organic looking product, and the other being that the coating was really not offering any improvement in seed establishment. In fact, we were beginning to see that companies were budgeting to coat less seed in the future. I was very encouraged to see this, as I'm sure all of you were as well. It's nice to see seed going out in the bag instead of clay. Unfortunately, the extreme shortage of seed has seen a resurgence in coating. Almost all of the seed that we are currently shipping out is going to coaters. Even companies who have never coated before are coating all of their seed that's going into retail this year. The customer who shops at the hardware store does not compute that half of what he is taking home is not seed, but clay. He came in for a 5-pound bag of grass seed. He goes home with 2.5 pounds of seed and 2.5 pounds of clay. The massive amounts of coating will either be a perfect solution to our seed shortage or is going to end up for a massive hangover into the next year. At the moment, sales are good, prices are good, and the party is in full swing. If for some reason, like the weather is poor, or maybe customers are just sick of being in their backyard after being confined to them for the last 2 years, and then the customers do not buy the seed this spring, and as a result, retailers are left with expensive seed, the party will turn into a hangover before we can say sell. Currently, though the future is so bright that I have to wear shades, there is excellent demand for all turf grasses at this time, and we'll end up with next to zero inventory in either the grower or processor's barns this summer. Also, we don't see an increase in the amount of harvested acres coming up for this harvest in 2022. Hopefully, those acres will produce considerably more than they did last year. Last fall's good rains gave us quite a bit better establishment than what it looked like in July. And I would think that it would be prudent to say that we should estimate an average crop for 2022. If we harvest 20 to 25 million pounds, which is in the average range, we may find that we will not be able to market all of that product at the current pricing. Saying that, I don't believe that prices are going to fall out of bed either. At those kind of supply levels, we may find that pricing is only slightly higher than historical average rather than double the historical. I would think, though, that the entire grass crop will come to market very quickly. Growers will need cash to be able to pay off those expensive inputs And as a result, we may see that during harvest, there is a drag on prices as processors try to slow down the seed coming in. If every pound costs more than double, it ends up being a strain on the system. It may turn out that marketing during harvest may not be the best time to do. Try and market before or after. For the longer term, things get good for the next few years. The heat dome not only affected grass crops, but also went after grains and oilseeds. Prices for these commodities are at a record level, and producers wish to plant these commodities this spring to take advantage of those high prices. As a result, processors will have to be offering very good contracts to entice growers to seed grass seed. Processors have responded and are offering contracts that we've never seen before, even going out as far as into 2024. For many of us that want a grass rotation in our farm because it's critical to the success of our farm, and for those of us that feel that way, it is a good time to sign contracts that ensure the long-term viability of turfgrass production. It is very easy to be complacent when everything is going our way. It may be that prices will be higher in the fall than they are right now, but it is hard to go wrong when you can sign a contract at historically high prices. When pricing is at levels that we could only dream of 2 years ago, it may be a good time to contact your seed processor and inquiring not only about contracts for 2022, but 23 and into the future. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Doug. I think we're going to hold questions till the end once all the speakers are done here this morning, the marketing speakers. So our next speaker is Heather Kirschbaumer. Again, I'm sure everybody on the call is very familiar with Heather. She's always been involved with the Peace Region Forward Seed Association and always active in even national priorities that are facing, the forward seed growers and seed trade and stuff like that. So very active in terms of those types of things. And Heather is the office and sales manager up at Golden Acre Seeds up at Fairview. And Heather's also been really good at giving us market dates for probably the last quite a few years. But today she's going to give us an update on the forage legume situation.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Peace Region Association's annual meeting. I am here today on legume seeds. So first, I'm going to talk about what you already are quite aware of. The first one is the weather. We've had unprecedented weather last summer where we had the heat wave of over 40 degrees for almost 2 weeks. And it really had an effect on a lot of the crops in the area. The advantage, I guess, that we had from the weather was for the clovers and the alfalfa, it didn't seem to affect them as bad. The weather on the grass seeds was decimating, but on the alfalfas and the red clover, Alside clover, and sweet clover, it seemed to actually help with the seed maturity. It had an effect because of the drought along with it. And so a lot of the older stands had a tough time accessing enough water. But for the new seeded stands, it seemed like they weathered the weather very well. The second item is competing crop prices. So with other crops having such high prices right now, that will definitely have an impact on the market for now and going into the future. The third item, US exchange, is always a factor. Exchange on our dollar, because a lot of our crops are sold in American dollars. This always has an effect on the actual grower price level. US exchange has been reasonably level for quite a while at about $1.25 to $1.27. So it hasn't had a big influence from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. The next one I'll talk about is seed acreage. And it seems like our acres of legumes has been low and seems to be staying quite low. We have organic growers that always use acres in their rotations. We have the dedicated seed growers who continue to grow a certain amount of the legumes, but overall acreage is definitely down. US and Canadian demand. The demand on all of the forage seeds is up this year in the US and in Canada, primarily because of the weather, because of all these other factors. Demand based on supply being low, demand seems to be higher than usual. A few more recent market influences would be things such as fertilizer prices, and this, along with diesel fuel price and availability for spring, and the fact that we have very low carryover of many of the legume seeds, will have an impact on what is going to be planted in the spring. If fertilizer prices or availability and diesel fuel remain low, which is what we're forecasting, there might be incentive for people to put more forage seed acres back into the ground again. They take less inputs of fertilizers, so it will have a perhaps increase in acres as a result. The other market influence that nobody knows what will happen yet is this war. This is brand new, unprecedented for any of us. It has had impacts on certain markets, and we don't know yet if it's going to have an impact on the legume seed market. So the legumes I'll just talk about quick here is red clover, Alsike clover, sweet clover, and alfalfa. I'll dive right in and give a ballpark number on some prices for red clover, and I'm talking about single cut red clover, which is primarily what is grown up in the piece. The price starts at about $1.75 for common number 1, but it can be more depending on, of course, the quality. Quality is always such an issue in clovers. If you have a little bit of other crop, it can affect the price. If you have weeds, it can affect the price in all of the clovers. So red clover, the prices have been probably as high as $2 a pound, but probably they're more in the $1.75 to $1.80 range. Alsike clover, same thing, quality is everything when you're trying to sell seed. So there has been prices probably as high as $1.75 or even higher, but probably starting price of $1.50 and then up from there. Sweet clover is really in demand right now, very short supply. Price starting at $1.30, but it could even be as high as $1.40 or $1.50. But again, it's because the supply is almost non-existent. Alfalfa, tap alfalfa, just common. The prices are ranging starting about $1.90. And again, you may get a higher price if you have the top quality. Creeping root alfalfa is always a little bit of a premium over a tap. So it's somewhere in that 25 to 30 cent premium over just a common taproot. And the proprietary varieties, which we don't grow a lot of in the piece, but they grow a lot more of them in southern Alberta, other parts of Canada, but they have a definite benefit to growing them. You get a bonus on your price, but you have to make sure it makes the grade. So I thought I'd just take you back a couple of years, because 2 years ago, everything was almost half price to what it is right now, or less. So prices can change very fast. Market, all these influences have a dramatic change in the price, and everything has gone up proportionately high in the legumes, not as much as in the grass seed, but they are going up as well. Legumes are also on the climb. So in the future, my crystal ball, if anybody else has a crystal ball, the potential for prices to remain as they are or even increase, but it all will depend again on things like the weather. If we have another hot, dry summer, that's going to have an impact on our seed once again. On these acres, depending on how many acres go in this spring or have been seeded last year and come into production this year, this will have an impact on our supply and demand. The demand, again, especially when things are tight, demand seems to be really high up front because everybody's trying to fight to get the best quality lots first. So anything with real top quality is going to probably sell at a premium. And it also depends on the prices of our other competing crops as to whether people are going to go into the clover situation. If canola stays high, if barley stays high, I'm already hearing farmers are changing their plans based on what the price commodities will be. Instead of planting down hay or pasture, they're talking about putting it into barley, taking advantage of high barley prices because it's just a flat pan. But all of these factors will have an impact on if our prices will remain where they are. There's potential for them to go up, but if we have record-breaking conditions, then we may see the prices staying where they are or even declining a little bit. So that's about it. I'd like to say thank you for the opportunity to give you this presentation. There's my information online. I'll just leave it for a minute or two here. Go to the next slide, which says questions. But I'm sorry, I am not here to answer questions, so I have to defer my questions to any others who can answer. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks, Heather. We always appreciate you giving us updates on the forager grass or forager legume markets, grass seed markets. So she's always eager to do that for us. So our last speaker for the marketing panel this morning is Kurt Schmann. I don't think we've had Kurt speak before for us, but it was pretty neat when Talon phoned him up, or they kind of contacted each other and was willing to give an update for us on the forage grasses. So Kurt, if you're not familiar with him or don't know him, Kurt is the president of Imperial Seeds. They're located just out of Winnipeg, around Winnipeg, where they have a seed cleaning plant or a processing plant, and also their offices, I believe. Kurt is in charge of the wholesale marketing of the seed that they purchase and grow and that sort of thing. Kurt's very familiar with up in the Peace Country. They do a little bit of contract production up here. Some Timothy's, I think, once in a while, and maybe some clover and a little bit of alfalfa. So yeah, he's familiar with what we do up here. And again, it was just nice to have someone different kind of give a update this morning on the forage grasses. So with that in mind, I'll pass it over to Kurt.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Peace River Forage Seed Association meeting. I am Kurt Schmann with Imperial Seed. I'm going to be providing the market outlook on forage grasses. A little bit of housekeeping. First, let's make sure you all know who and what Imperial Seed is. Imperial Seed is a forage, turf, and cover crop seed company. We retail these seeds across Western Canada through a number of dealers, approximately 100. They're the small mom and pop operations that are likely cleaning your seed down the road. We're not too big into the line companies, the UFAs or anything like that. Forage, turf, and cover crop seeds are clean, blended, and packaged and shipped from our Winnipeg location to your place. We also supply a number of other seed companies with their needs. Our main focus is forage and turf seed contract production, seed multiplication services. We obtain contracts from around the world. We bring their parent seed here to Canada for seed multiplication. These contracts are placed throughout Western Canada with seed producers such as yourselves and others. We provide agronomic advice throughout the growing season, collect producer samples once the seed is harvested, and we constantly communicate with our customers and our producers so that both are aware of what their crop potential is. The seed is then transported to Winnipeg to our new state-of-the-art processing facility where the seed is cleaned to contract spec. Once the seed is processed, tested, packaged, and tested again, it is then shipped to its final destination, such as China, all of Western Europe, Ukraine, United States, Argentina, and of course Canada. Currently, Imperial Seed exports to just over 30 countries. Imperial Seed does own and operate Integrity Seed Lab, which is a fully accredited seed testing laboratory, offering outside service testing, but its main focus is quality control for Imperial Seed. Before we get into the meat of the conversation, I will be updating the markets for the species of slender wheatgrass, crested wheatgrass, smooth, and meadow brome grass and timothy. But let's just put a smile on our faces first before we get into it. There is this farmer, let's call him Fritz. And then Fritz was walking his field of meadow brome grass, and he gave the ground a kick, and next thing you know, he kicked up one of those little genie teapots. So he picks up the teapot, gives it a rub, and out pops this genie. And the genie says, "Mr. Farmer, what would you like?" He says, "Oh, my name is Fritz, and I would like," the genie says, "I have 3 wishes. What would you like?" "Oh, well, I would like my meadow brome grass field here to yield 1,500 pounds of clean seed." Genie looks at Fritz and says, "That's a tall order, my friend," but throughout the growing season, Fritz is watching his crop grow, and next thing you know, it's time to harvest, and he's got the biggest, best crop ever. The neighbors are envious. Fritz is looking at maybe 2,000 pounds of clean seed. It's fabulous. So he gets the crop harvested, puts it in the bin. He's smiling. A couple weeks after it's in the bin, Fritz goes for another walk, grabs that genie pot again, gives it a little rub. Genie pops out. "What would you like for your second wish, Fritz?" "Ah, I want meadow brome grass to be $5 a pound." Well, the next morning, Fritz phones a couple seed companies, and by God, they're all offering $5 a pound. It's a good day in blue sky, a really good day. So Fritz, walking into the field again a couple weeks later, grabs onto that genie pot, gives it one more rub, and genie pops out and, "Oh, Fritz, what would you like for your third and final wish?" "Ah, I would like meadow brome grass to be $5 a pound." The genie looks at Fritz a little puzzled and said, "But Fritz, that was your second wish." "Yes, I know, but I didn't sell it." People, come on, some profit is better than no profit. Let's put a smile on our face. Now on to the forage grasses. Brome grasses. In 2021, we saw our lowest number of certified acres inspected in Canada since 2014, with only 6,290 acres inspected. That's both meadow and smooth brome. In 2017, we saw a high at 10,750 acres. Since then, it's been a steady decline. Declines happen for a number of reasons. Failure to establish new field, crop mutations, but mainly it's the producer's ability to create a solid profit compared to other species, and this was the case. This was the case with the brome grasses. Now we have very strong prices, tight supplies, and low acres. Oh joy! 1 year too much seed, not enough. Well, the market is tight. The amount of acres produced in North America all produced a short crop, with the exception of the northeast corner of Saskatchewan. From Kansas to the Peace River to the Pacific Northwest, the yields were down. Prices reflect that. The northeast corner of Saskatchewan did receive some moisture, and there they managed to produce an above average crop in some cases, and they also managed to get new fields established as the seedlings look very good. So now there's less seed around with a high cost. What is happening? Well, right now we have a lot of seed companies are coating their brome grasses with a 50% seed coating by weight. We're not here to discuss the value of coated seed or not, but we do know one thing: adding 50% of a coating does double your inventory. Also, we've seen some of our export markets disappear, such as China. Canada is and always will be an exporting nation. It doesn't matter if we're going to talk about brome grass, crested wheatgrass, timothy, lumber, canola, oil. We export. So we're always got to be aware of our export markets and our export where the price becomes too expensive for them. And right now the bromes have reached that market. The long and the short of the bromes, the markets are firm and are expected to be firm for the next couple of years. Inventories are low, acres are low, we've got failed establishments, so those are all positive things to keep the market moving in this proper direction. There are things to watch for though. The United States if they end up with any favorable crop conditions, Kansas City can produce a heck of a pile of it. Pacific Northwest right now has had some pretty decent growing conditions. They've got some good fall moisture, so there is the competition. There is some areas that are shaping up to be in pretty decent shape. We've got good snow cover in the piece. Moisture is there. We're going to have to watch that as we go forward. If I had to pick one, I think smooth might be a little tighter than meadow brome grass. So to take a look at things, these are some of the issues that we're seeing. Things to watch for. And here are inspected acres. 2021, 6290, 17, 10,000. Take a look, 2012, 5,100. So right now, we're sort of in the lower average of where our acres tend to be. So not a bad position. Slender wheatgrass. This is a harder one to track because all the wheatgrass species are lumped together. Crested wheatgrass would be probably the strongest one. So, and a lot of slender is common. So you got to take these numbers with a bit of grain of salt. In crop 21, we inspected 4,856 acres. This is the lowest since 2013 when we inspected 3,857. Again, these numbers capture all the wheatgrass species and no common seed. The slender crop is primarily common. There was a bit of carryover from crop 20 as there seemed to be more pounds produced than what the market could handle. This crop is mainly export to the United States and to China. China is a big consumer, and again, when we start looking at currency and just market conditions, China is a buyer-sensitive market. So if the price gets too high, they will pull back, and that's what we've seen happen on the bromes and the slender right now. Also on the crested. Only difference here is even though we have a lighter crop, right now there's resellers of slender, both from primaries and from secondaries. So, you know, on the brome grasses, there's really nothing available. You can't go out and buy it. But here on the slender, you can turn around, you can still buy slender wheatgrass in the market. So I'm not feeling a real yee-haw on this crop. You know, the carryover, the lack of export demand, no real strong North American demand. So I don't know if we're going to experience some downward pressure on this or if it's just going to remain flat. But this one is not a real yeehaw crop. Looking at the crested wheatgrass, and again, this is where most of those inspected acres fall. It's produced right across the prairies, and it's sort of a drought-tolerant grass, so it actually didn't do too bad this year. We had areas here in Manitoba that produced a fairly decent crop. Saskatchewan produced some crop. It's also grown all over the United States. There is no seed coating going on with the wheat grasses at all. But again, this market does have a bit of an export market. So again, not real yee-haw on this one. It's not a terrible situation, but just not that really strong feeling of you know, yee-haw, you know, like I said, with the bromes and where things are looking at. So it's decent. I don't see it falling through the floor, but as I say, I don't see it being a runaway crop either. You know, things to note, we've got to watch that, you know, there is seed available, export market, currency, good growing conditions in all production areas. Our acres, like, you know, there we are. We talked about, you know, these low acres, and our fields don't establish in 1 year. They do take that seedling stage. So, you know, we're not about to put a whole bunch of crop in this year and have it affect this year's market. It'll affect further down the road. But, you know, 2021, there we are, 4,856 acres. 2013, that's going back a long ways, 3,857. So, you know, we're right in our average acre area, but with the current crop conditions, it's now on to Timothy. Timothy, no lie, it's the crop I'm most familiar with. For a number of years, Manitoba has produced the most amount of certified acres. Alberta produced the most pounds due to a large surface area in common. In 2020, that switched, and Alberta is now the leader for certified acres and the leader for total acres of period in production for Timothy. Total inspected acres 29,857, with 12,631 of them being Alberta. It's not from a lack of trying here in Manitoba. It's just that these drought conditions we've experienced for the last number of years have really hampered our seedlings. Many acres have been planted, but few have established. These dry conditions have also limited the crop produced. Demand has been consistent from around the world, and again, Canada is an exporting nation and most of our timothy is exported. This year, the surprise was Europe actually exported into Canada. Europe's situation, crop was a little short, but their carryover kept things from running away. And like I said, Europe was shipping common seed to Canada for the first time. I don't recall that ever. The outlook for timothy looks pretty decent. We take a look at the acres are low, the failure to the failed establishments, it's looking pretty decent. Europe, even though they were exporters this year, their situation is pretty tight. So over the next few years, we even actually have some seed houses coating timothy this year. So over the next few years, I think this market is going to remain firm until we see acres pick up and things sort of level out. So overall, like I say, timothy, feeling pretty good about it. No real carryover to worry about. And like I say, when we start importing seed, you know that North American is short on seed. When we take a look at our acres, again, 2021, 29,857, going to 15, 43,763, 2010, 26,462. Right now, we're sort of in the acres are below the long-term average, and we also know that we have seen a reduction in common seed acres. So the total surface area for timothy in Canada is on the shy side. Again, feeling pretty positive about that market. Right now, to wrap things up, the overall view of things is pretty simple. You know, if we see these weather patterns repeat ourselves in 2021, I don't expect much movement on price. There may be some articles, there might be a slight softening, but we have to remain competitive. Our industry has to remain competitive with the input costs if we want to see our crops keep growing. So I do expect things to remain fairly decently unless we have some wild adverse weather where areas get lots of rain, harvest goes perfect, and we have an abundance. We have that Fritz crop of 1,500 pounds. You know, things that we have to watch for are, you know, currencies that can play a risk, inventory, exports. World is a crazy place right now, but overall, I feel pretty good about the 2022 crop as we're rolling forward. So you should feel good about it too. I'm available for any questions now. Here's our contact information. I'll leave this slide up as we're doing questions, and that way if anyone needs to get a hold of us, you're more than welcome to give us a call, shoot us an email, so on and so forth. Thank you and have a great day, and I would like to thank the Forward Seed Association for inviting me to do this presentation.
Okay, thanks. Good, and again, thanks again to Doug and Heather as well. Again, it's always a bit of a struggle to find people who are willing to give some market updates, so we really appreciate them taking the time and effort to pull that stuff together and actually do the presentation. So I'll pass it over to Kaylee, I guess. I think there's going to be some time for some questions now, and I'll let Kaylee handle that part of it.
Not a problem. So at this point, going to lift microphone controls. So if you have any questions for two of our speakers, I know Doug and Kurt are both on the call, feel free to either pop them in the chat or again, you can turn your microphone on and ask it that way. If someone else is speaking, you can always raise your hand by clicking that raise hand button to let us know that you would also like to turn your mic on. Danny, it looks like you got a question to kick us off with.
Yeah, thanks for showing up, Kurt and Doug. Maybe a question for both of you guys, and it has to do with the turf markets. Have you noticed the Americans being gun shy since this invasion started? 14, 15 days ago. And are you kind of worried about what the end use will be? I know your videos were probably taped before all this happened. The world changes constantly, but are you nervous on that? Because I can see the end user having to fill their tank and putting food on their table before they're gonna worry about putting grass seed in their front lawns. So just a comment on that.
I noticed in after the World Trade Center, the phones just totally stopped on that day. And that was the beginning of a real downward pricing trend and a lack of use. We haven't seen that yet, although I will say that the conversations have been, they've been quite hesitant for the past 2 weeks now. And, speaking yesterday with a few, I definitely noticed a more, we are upset about this, but I found the Americans take it much more to heart. And I think it has a potential to cause problems. We don't see it yet, but there is a chance of it.
I would agree with Doug. Ourselves, we're just finishing off right now. We're focusing on perennial ryegrass, which is going to be exported to the United States for the overseeding market. So what we're doing right now is we're actually cleaning seed that would be seeded onto the golf courses in September or October of next year, or of this year coming up, for us Canadians to go down and golf. Right now, the flurry is, short. Everything's, seed is short. Things getting coated. Haven't seen it yet, but you're right. I agree with Doug. Times in front of us are crazy, so it'll be interesting to see where it is. I think the market is so hot right now. There will be some cooling, but I'm still feeling pretty optimistic about it all.
Thank you, Kurt and Doug. Call for oh, there we go. Bill's coming through with another question. So Bill asks, can any of you provide an update on hybrid brome seed market?
The hybrid seed market on the brome is all contracted and proprietary, so it's very hard to, like I say, to be able to report on that. It's in the hands of the companies. It's not like Carlton or Fleet brome grasses that are public varieties. So the demand is decent on it. I believe they're still working on yields. Seems to still have some problems where you can have a strong yield one year and a weaker yield the next. But other than that, it's finding its place in the market. Pricing is always a challenge because, again, you have to be able to, we know where cattle prices are, and the money's not being made at the cattle guys, it's being made in the packers. So to go and tell this cattle guy that you've got this great new brome grass that's going to do him wonders, well, if he doesn't have money to pay for it, it doesn't really matter. So that one is, like I say, it's out there. Myself, I'm not a big player in it, so I can't, like I say, it's all in the hands of bigger companies with the contract. So can't really say too much about it. Yellow alfalfa, there's a demand out of Europe for a small amount of it. A lot of times when we see the yellow alfalfa, we know that the yellow and the cream do indicate a creeping rooted variety, but there is that yellow taprooted variety alfalfa. It's, again, in today's world where we see so many things changing, people are starting to look at disease packages when they're purchasing alfalfa. In the United States, we sell what's called on the disease rating index. So Pytharia root rot, a number of other pests and diseases are rated against it. And this is a challenge when we start dealing with common seed. Yes, common seed is there, but there's been so many advancements on alfalfa that common seed ends up being, these things, if they're not inspected, or if it's not a contracted variety, they end up being, I won't call it a filler, but, it becomes that price point purchase. When people start taking a look at the varieties of the multi-leafs, or, the new spreading root varieties, or we've even got bloat reduced varieties, high gest and boost for grazing tolerances. Alfalfa's moved a long way. So some of these common varieties that we're used to that work well, they grow well in our area. Sometimes the demand isn't as strong as what we'd like. So that one, I expect it to remain pretty flat. Alfalfa started off pretty hot. There's a couple weeks where the price got firm and it backed off. So Heather's pricing is very accurate and maybe even a little optimistic, but that's all I can say on that one.
Great. Thank you so much, Franz, for that question. Last call. We have time for one more quick question before I turn it back over to Calvin to get us into the next presentations. And just a reminder, if you did miss any of the 3 presentations of our panelists, they will be available via the recording as well once we are wrapped up here. Okay. Unless someone's frantically typing, it doesn't look like we have anything else coming in. So thank you very much, Doug and Kurt and Calvin. I will invite you back.
Okay. Once again to Doug, Kurt, and Heather for doing that. The rest of the morning here, we're just going to get some updates from the research scientists at the Beaverlodge Research Station that do work on forage seed crops. First of all, we'll have Jennifer Otani speak. I mean, everybody's familiar with Jennifer. She's always out in the fields in the summertime with her staff, or her staff are running around the countryside collecting insects and doing surveys on not only some of our forage seed fields, but also canola and cereal fields as well. So she's a pretty busy lady, and we're fortunate to have her there. Anyways, what we thought we'd ask Jennifer to do this morning, again, she's the pest management specialist at Beaverlodge with AAFC. And we asked Jennifer to give a bit of an update on the European skipper and Timothy, as we've been seeing more of that. Well, we've seen that insect in our Timothy fields over the last number of years, and I'm getting a few more calls on it. Guys are noticing it a little more and more. Jennifer's done some surveys over the last number of years as well in clover fields and finding some weevils that she wanted to maybe give us an update on. And then a bit of an update too about the red clover case bearer larvae in our red clover seed fields. So with that in mind, I'll pass it over to Jennifer.
Hello everyone, my name is Jennifer Otani and I'm at the Beaverlodge Research Farm with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. Today I'm giving a bit of an update on a few select insect pest groups that are in Timothy and in clover seed production systems. And today I'm going to be in the background using my Twitter account and available to answer some questions if folks use the hashtag of 22 PRFSA AGM. And so I'll be checking the account and trying to answer some questions if folks want to fire whatever queries they have to that. Otherwise, I will be joining the meeting again later in the day to answer questions too. So we're going to blast through a number of insects. I want to just acknowledge the individuals who are very much responsible for implementing some of the field monitoring in the Peace River region on behalf of our program. These would include Amanda Jorgensen, Keith Uloth, and of course Shelby Dufton. We'll start with this image, which is taken from the Alberta Forage Manual. There are 2 chapters in this manual that Julie Soroka and myself wrote and edited. The QR code in the upper right corner, if you scan that with your phone, that will take you to the actual website to download the free PDF copy of that manual. But what I wanted to talk about today are the insect pests that are highlighted in red here. So we're going to start with European skipper, but you can see we're also going to transition over to clover and talk about weevils and red clover case bearer. So starting with European skipper, it's a very pretty butterfly, but that's about all that it's good for in terms of Timothy production systems. So interestingly, in North America, we call it the European skipper. In Europe, it's actually referred to as the Essex skipper. Same species, Thymelicus lineola, but the area of origin for European skipper is actually Eurasia and northwestern Africa. European skipper came to Canada. The first sighting, or at least where it's attributed to have started in Canada, was in London, Ontario in 1910. And it sounds as though from the literature that it was actually contaminated imported Timothy seeds that were brought in from Europe. It is a very showy, bright orange butterfly. It's also very easy to see if they're in high numbers, simply because those butterflies really like to stay close to the ground and flit from plants to plants. The larvae, however, are very camouflaged. The photo here in the middle shows a very nice, fairly large instar larvae, so fairly mature. But these European skippers belong to a group of insects that are called leaf tires. And really this little white band you're seeing here in the middle of the middle photo is actually silk that they spin to pull the edges of the leaf together. And that really helps camouflage them even further. They are bright green larvae, and so once you know what you're looking for, they can be easy to see, but it's really actually surprisingly difficult. Their patterning really does allow them to camouflage. Well, on the right, this is one of the problems that European skipper causes. It's a defoliator. So essentially it ties these leaves together, and then the larvae move up and down the leaf and actually start to defoliate or chew away the leaf. In this case, in this figure on the right, you can see that portions of the leaf are actually missing. And of course, in high populations with high levels of feeding pressure, they will defoliate the entire leaf. In some cases, they will actually move into the younger, greener seed heads, but primarily it's the leaf area that's actually affected. Well, European or Essex skipper, it's one generation per year. So the flight season here in North America is attributed to early June to mid-July. Here in the Peace River region, what we've seen is that really the end of June is when we start to see very mature larvae, and the first butterflies start to tend to fly at that time. So we typically recommend that growers want to backtrack at least 4, maybe even 5 to 6 weeks, depending on how the spring has actually unfolded for temperature. But at least 4 to 5 weeks prior to the end of June, folks should be scouting in their Timothy, because that's when you're going to see the first early instar larvae. And that is in fact the population that is the easiest to manage, if we can call it manageable. Well, the butterflies have a number of nectar sources. In this case, these butterflies do feed as adults, because not all butterflies do. You can see that nectar sources include a number of weed species, but also our clovers. But more importantly, the host plants that the European skipper are seeking out to lay eggs on include Timothy, also a number of other grasses. I think one of the ironies here is that it will actually also oviposit and reproduce on couch grass, or quack grass for us here in the Peace. So European skipper can arise in fields, and it can be very aggregated. And that is a product of the way that the females will lay eggs. So typically a female will come to a plant, they'll lay eggs in batches, sometimes batches of up to 30 eggs. And these eggs are actually laid in little strings, and they're fairly well cemented to the plant tissue. The eggs then overwinter in that leaf material, and this can be a real easy way for European skipper to be distributed to other areas across the prairies. Essentially, the eggs can be in hay and they can survive in hay, and when that hay is moved around, voila, suddenly we have larvae hatching the following spring in whatever field that hay may be sitting in. A really important thing to note is that seed cleaning will not remove all the eggs. Sometimes the females will lay eggs even on the seed head, so this becomes really important. And in fact, you'll remember I mentioned that it was actually contaminated seed came from Europe. This is attributed to our initial populations of European skipper in Eastern. Well, very quickly, I was asked to kind of try and highlight some of the control measures for European skipper, and it is a very short list because there aren't great options. Cultural control measures, especially if you're actually growing Timothy in a pasture or a mixed situation, one of the first things they recommend is to try and actually keep Timothy separate from your nectar sources. That is pretty difficult to do in a mixed stand of hay. But the idea here is that if you're feeding the adults, then you're going to eventually get eggs laid on whatever Timothy is in that hay field, and so you can expect then there to be a European skipper larvae. Removal of cut grass or bales. Now this can, or maybe it isn't, a good way to manage European skipper in your fields. The idea here is that whatever eggs are in that plant material can actually be removed by physically taking that cut grass material or the bales away. Now this is really important for individuals that are looking at exporting Timothy. Please be aware that if you're trying to export internationally, there are some very strict rules associated with pesticide use, but also in terms of European skipper and trying to hold back the spread of that species to other areas. Now, in terms of chemical control here in Canada, we have a very limited array of limited options. Let's put it this way. There are a number of products that are registered, but all of them are biologicals, and all of them are incorporating the active ingredient of Bacillus thuringiensis. This is BT, and it's a biological or product of a biological process that is actually killing the insects. BT, or Bacillus thuringiensis, is particularly useful at managing defoliating Lepidopteran larvae. Now, the key thing with all of these products that are registered here in Canada is that you really need to be monitoring, and if you have densities beyond the action threshold of greater than 6 larvae per 12 inches by 12 inch area, then these products will work best on early instar larvae. They will work on later instar larvae, but not as well. Also, in some guides, there is reference to a relatively higher water volume, a minimum of 300 liters of water per hectare. That would really want to be checked with whatever product and whatever label recommendations would come with that product. The idea here is that Timothy foliage, you need a higher water volume to get good coverage of this product across all of the foliage to protect it adequately. Now, the good thing about biologicals is that there is a pre-harvest interval of 0 days. So literally you can spray these products right up until the day that you actually harvest it. That is not the same with some of our other traditional chemistries. I do want to emphasize here in Canada, Desis, Matador, and Lorsban are not registered for the control of European skipper in Timothy. So please be very aware of what you're choosing if you have high populations that you need to manage. Okay. More help can be found from Health Canada. They have their pesticide label online search tool. This first QR code on your left here would actually draw you to that website if you're working on a desktop, for example, and could search keywords. Otherwise, the middle QR code will pull you to the Health Canada pesticide label mobile app. So you can download an app for an Apple phone or something that's running on Android. Finally, a really important resource before the Blue Book in Alberta, the real reference guide was the WCCP, or Western Committee on Crop Pests Guide to Integrated Control of Insect Pests of Crops. Now this QR code on the far right would draw you to that guide, and you can choose between a number of different crops and look at those references as a resource for products too. Well, I'm going to switch gears and move into the legume feeding case bearers. This is, of course, our red clover case bearer. Hopefully everyone's very familiar with the infographic in terms of the life cycle, where that insect is feeding and what kind of damage it would cause during a growing season. We did a number of years of work looking at different insecticide products applied to some of our producer cooperator field plots. I want to just remind you that these years from 2006 to 2010 were some astronomical populations of red clover case bearer. So this is work that we're actually hoping that we might be able to revisit now that some of our populations seem to have moved back down to a lower level. You can see that there are some good pieces of work from Scandinavia in terms of actually looking at how many flower heads a larvae would actually feed on per day. Again, that's in red clover, and I believe that's in Finland. And also the categorization of severe infestations in red clover, again out of Scandinavia. We have had populations far in excess of some of those densities. However, the products that we have tested so far have had little to no impact on improving yield or protecting red clover seed production. Well, over the many years we've been surveying throughout the region, and very quickly, these are points throughout the Peace River region. We can see falaires here underneath these right-hand black dots, Grand Prairie here towards the middle, and then out into the BC piece here, up in your upper left. But essentially, we've confirmed that the red clover case bear very quickly was distributed throughout the entire region. And it was essentially on volunteer plants that we could find in the ditch that we could confirm that they had spread already throughout the region pretty much by 2007. For sure by 2019 they're found throughout many portions of the region. I'm just going to quickly talk about some of the densities. So just as a reminder, in 2006, here's a comparison of what we were seeing in first year Alsike in the upper left, first year red clover in your lower left. Okay, the scale and the densities of red clover case bear larvae in particular, these open bars, were quite different in Alsike compared to red. But then when they were actually monitored in second year seed stands, here on the right, again, higher populations in older stands of Alsike and red clover here in the lower right, but really it was an exponential increase in our second year red clover stands. So literally 875 larvae per 100 sweeps. So phenomenal densities of larvae. That is why we do not recommend that you keep red clover in for a second year seed production. Well, this observation that we've seen consistently over all of our years of field monitoring of many red clover case bear in our red clover, and then just a few of the larvae in the Alsike comparatively, has actually led us to do a number of repeated growth cabinet studies where we've actually been looking at field collected larvae and placing them on individual flower heads of different clover species and trying to follow through to see what led to this huge discrepancy between the populations in red versus Alsike clover. So some of this data, it's spread over a number of different years because of the access to the growth cabinet and the space available to replicate. What we're looking at here is actually the percent mortality of those larvae that we caged on individual flowers. And in this case, these are our Alsike plants. So what was interesting to us is that we were actually starting to see initially some fairly high numbers of larvae that were dying when we kept them caged on Alsike flowers individually. And what we were hoping to look at also was larval weight gain, and we do have some of that data, but the interesting thing is it's turning out it's not as significant. However, when we look at the mortality, we are seeing some interesting trends. I've just uncovered some of the red clover data, and really what I want to draw your attention to is that we have had lower sample size. However, the mortality is very low compared to what seems to be happening in the Alsike flowers. Again, just kind of confirming that there's something going on with those flowers that's leading to those discrepancies in those larval densities in these two crops. Well, we've gone ahead and we've started to look at other species of clovers because we know from the literature that red clover case bear can and will utilize other clover species as a host. So this is crimson clover that's been run over a few years. And again, we're seeing some mortality, but not as much as what we're seeing in some of the Alsike samples. When we look at the arrowleaf clover that was kindly obtained for us with help from Nicole Anderson, we're seeing almost no mortality from the red clover case bear that were caged on those flowers. So if any of you growers are thinking about moving into other species of clover, what I want to really emphasize is species that have very low mortality would suggest to us that those are going to be ideal hosts for the red clover case bear populations that we have. So we haven't looked at any sort of phenology and how these plants grow, but just looking at mortality when we cage these larvae on these flowers suggests some plants or species of clover are worth avoiding. So again, white clover, stone clover, zigzag clover, these three species of clover are well known in the literature to act as alternate hosts for the red clover case bear and definitely suitable hosts. I think folks in New Zealand are dealing with red clover case bear now in white clover. The interesting thing here is our growth cabinet study is really showing again that it survived very well on white clover, survived very well on zigzag clover, which is a species that we only found from the literature. However, with stone clover, we found actually fairly high levels of mortality on these 12 individuals that we were able to cage and rear through. So, I don't know what stone clover production acres look like, or if it's even a viable clover for our region, but there's a species that seems to not provide as good a host as what the Alsite clover. Of course, our sample size are spread all over the place, relatively small for some of these more obscure clover species, but we've been trying to do some of this work in the background to try and give growers some sense of what some of these different clovers might do in terms of the red clover casebearer larval feeding. Well, I'm going to move very quickly now to the clovers feeding weevils, and there are a whole schwack of weevils that are normally in clovers. I'm just highlighting here in red where some of those species would be on a clover plant, and you can see there's a number of different species, but also a few different groups. Well, I want to start with Cetona first, because the real worry for us in the Peace River region is that we now have this new invasive species, the pea leaf weevil here on the left, that has been confirmed in a number of pea fields in the Peace River region. Now, we're fortunate to continue to do some of this work, but we have expanded some of our monitoring in some of our clover and alfalfa seed stands, because we know pea leaf weevil, especially the overwintered adults, they will rapidly feed on new seedings of alfalfa, and we have no sense of what they will do in newly seeded clover. However, all 4 species of these weevils, which are all closely related Cetona species, these are all found throughout the Peace River region. It's only pea leaf weevil that seems to still be in a few little pockets in the Peace that we're continuing to monitor. When I show you some of these maps, this is the pea leaf weevil map from 2019, and I think there are current maps that are more up to date. However, in 2019, this is where we started to see a bit of a spread with green dots in more locations throughout the Peace River region. So black dots on this map here in the Peace indicate that there were no pea leaf weevil feeding notches found in pea fields that were surveyed. However, the green dots do indicate a small level of feeding damage, which reflects the fact that we think that the pea leaf weevil is showing up there. And that gets confirmed with pea leaf weevil pitfall traps that are deployed in peas, more widespread, but also we are now starting to do some of that monitoring in our alfalfa and clover seed production stands. So coming back to red clover casebearer, I was asked to give a bit of an update on some of the current densities. So what we're looking at here, and I'm sorry it's super small, but we're using virtual, so I'm going to hope that you can see it. We're looking at an alfalfa seed stand that we're monitoring over here by Jureville. This is the seasonal populations of larvae and adults in 50 sweeps. So very low densities in our first year Alsite seed production year. When we look at another field here, this is near Eaglesham, again Alsite clover, fairly low densities. So this is essentially 2 or 3 adults per 50 sweeps, so very low numbers, very low larval densities also. Now the sweep net is not always the most ideal way to monitor red clover casebearer larvae, but when we start to compare it to the red clover, and again this is first year seed stand, this is over towards Guy, we're starting to see quite a difference, which is historically, again, what we normally expect in Alsite versus red clover. So solid bars are the adults showing up, the open bars are then the populations of larvae. And of course they're increasing because we have larvae continuing to develop and start to develop the more mature cases, which are easier to sweep and assess for population densities. And then here's another field, again by Guy, lower densities, but we're starting to see an exponential decrease in some of these densities in red clover. I want to just reinforce that this is only first year seed crops of red clover. We are struggling to find anyone that first of all has red clover. So if you do, please let us know, because we would like to be in some of those fields in 2022. But certainly we're starting to see finally some slightly lower populations. However, I do not think that they're necessarily low enough that you can keep your red clover for a second year of seed production in our region. So alongside with all of this monitoring, we are starting to, we've always looked at the arthropod biodiversity, and that is really the sweep samples get processed as far down to species for every individual as possible. Now, what we've been seeing over the last almost 4 or 5 years is that we're starting to see some of these weevil densities climbing up. And what is particularly worrisome from 2021 is that we're seeing this very tiny Tychius or seed-feeding weevil. We're starting to see it in some fairly high numbers. Now, the very interesting thing I want to draw your attention to is that our Tychius weevils are showing up in our L-site clover. So these same fields that we were monitoring up above for red clover casebearer, you can see that it's really starting to segregate so that we have red clover casebearer and red clover, and we have these Tychius seed-feeding weevils in our L-site clover. Now, this is a very interesting weevil because there's actually 3 species we can find here in the Peace River region. Primarily, we're dealing with Tychius picurostris, which is actually what some of our cohorts down in Oregon are dealing with in white clover. But the Tychius are actually, as larvae, feeding inside the florets and feeding on developing seed. And yes, that sounds very familiar. So we haven't been sitting on our butts because over the many years that we've been surveying at these various spots, again through the Peace River region, anything with orange and yellow has actually been where we are finding Tychius, and for a number of years. So 2007 we have a few sites, even as far back as 2001. 2019 we saw some numbers, and of course we don't have 2021 mapped here. So again, it's fairly widespread throughout the region, even though these are invasive species, but again, it's just a species that has quietly just spread, and probably for much longer than just the 2000s onward. It's a very tiny weevil as an adult, and this is also problematic. But essentially, you're looking at a wonderful picture, or a series of pictures from USDA, 2.5 millimeters long as an adult, and the larvae are about that same size, maybe slightly longer when they're at maturity, but very difficult, and they do overlap in terms of feeding niche because they're feeding inside the florets. So a very difficult group to work with, and very fairly highly concealed as larvae. Well, finally, in these same fields, we are also noticing that we are finally seeing lesser clover leaf weevil in some fairly high densities. Now, this has really not been the case. Lesser clover leaf weevil, which is actually these green bars, again, it seems to be very well distributed in our red clover seed production fields. In 2021, some fairly high densities. So Saskatchewan, interestingly, has typically seen fairly high densities of lesser clover leaf weevil. They've had red clover casebearer, but never at the densities that we have observed. But now we seem to be approaching a slightly similar situation in that lesser clover leaf weevil and the larvae are a shoot feeder as in our crops. But we're starting to see some very high numbers of lesser clover leaf weevil. Now, part of this will be the growing season that we had, which by all accounts was extreme. But again, it's very interesting because I've pushed all of these 3 groups together on this same set of charts so that you can see how segregated the Tychius weevils are on our L-site clover and how we are dealing with red clover casebearer and lesser clover leaf weevil here in our red clover. Now, these are just 4 sites from 2021, but this is very much a historical pattern that we're seeing, and I think we're very anxious to see what happens for 2022 for some of these densities. This is also why we will be trying to propose to do more work and looking at, really revisiting the chemical control aspects in red clover, because we're now seeing a different profile of insect that might be more easily managed with foliar insecticides compared to the red clover casebearer. And again, lesser clover leaf weevil, this has been a weevil that's been throughout the region for many years, and the surveying definitely confirms that it's absolutely everywhere even on volunteer clover plants, so it's no big surprise. Well, there's actually a long list of insects that can be found in our clovers. The insects that I've highlighted in red were things that we're very anxiously watching for 2022. The extreme heat and the growing conditions, really, we're not sure what to expect for this next year in terms of how those species, many of which actually overwinter as adults, we're not really sure what to expect for some of the densities early in the spring. Snow cover, plant health, winter hardiness of some of our clovers, these things are all going to factor in. Finally, I just want to really emphasize the fact that the pollinators that we're dealing with in our clovers, and not only just the pollinators, but some of our natural enemies like the parasitoids that would be attacking our cutworms. Please be very mindful and try to do your best in terms of actually field scouting and getting some assessments of densities in your fields, and then be really dealing with some of the very limited control options that we're dealing with in forage seed production. This is nothing new to any of you, and I think if anything, I would make a plug for some of these other insects that we are still not fully understanding well, and not understanding how well and how far-reaching their utilization of forage seed production stands really is in the Peace River region. Well, I think I will end with a thanks. Many individuals, many funding support sources. I will just actually really thank our producer cooperators, many of whom we've been working with for almost 10 years. These people that allow us to access the land are really pivotal to our data collection and really contribute to our overall understanding, not just of what's happening now, but also over a historical period, not hysterical, but really understanding how things are changing. And I think it's really important that we have that opportunity, and we're trying to make the most by actually trying to get species-specific information. I'm going to leave it here with useful connections, QR codes, some other URLs, and I think I'm out of time. Thanks very much, and I welcome any questions, or I'll be on my Twitter account, again, hashtag PRFSA AGM, and I'll be back at the meeting later today. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. And I guess, Kaylee, was there any questions for Jennifer before we get on to Nydia next?
I didn't see any come in the chat, but we'll give a quick call for questions here before we jump on to Nydia. Oh, Danny, go ahead. Oh.
Did you say Jennifer was still on the call, or she's going to be on the call later?
Nope, she's on the call right now.
Okay, Jennifer, I got I don't know, I don't call it a crazy question, but you're looking at higher mortality rates on the case bearer on Alsike. Is it because Alsike has a natural end of flight, or is it because of the flower size of each individual flower?
Yeah, that's a super question, Danny. The experiment, the way it's set up, we're not able to parse out what might actually be the functional unit of really what's causing the mortality. We were first suspicious of just the flower size and the availability of nectar, because we think that that's what's contributing to the overall larval health or their weight gains. But it is a really interesting thing that we're consistently seeing higher mortality with these larvae. So the short answer is I don't know at this point.
Thanks.
Thank you. And then Franz has another question here. Does burning Timothy in the spring help?
That is a very good question. So I think that question is in light of the European skipper. And I think we haven't seen widespread burning, to my knowledge, in some of our grasses for a long time. So I'm not super anxious to be encouraging it. However, with European skipper, I think the issue there is that you would really want to be assessing what kind of stand age you're at, and then also looking at what kinds of densities are present in those stands. There's no question that removing that leaf material that would potentially have the overwintering eggs, that would be beneficial. But I think you'd really want to be weighing some of the other agronomic reasons to do the burning, and to really have a good handle on what kind of European skipper populations were present. And also really be thinking about how you're going to be using that field. Is it going to be hay? Is it seed production? You know, those are the types of questions you'd want to be really carefully considering.
Great, thank you for that. And then our final question comes from Navneet, and I'm going to, perfect, with your question.
Hi, Jennifer. Navneet here. First of all, I would like to acknowledge Great Dog and also acknowledge your help with Case Bearer project in Oregon. So I am really intrigued to see the Ticus species that you have in Canada. At this point, we thought we have only one species, Ticus picrostrius, but we may have like other two species that you mentioned in your talk. So maybe we can talk after your presentation today to see if you can help us with some taxonomy of other Ticus species that you were seeing in clover production, L-site mostly, I guess, right? So yeah, it will be interesting to see what we have in Oregon, and then if we can collaborate on this. Yeah, we have this ongoing project to screen different insecticides and screen for resistance for pyrethroids in white clover seed, the Ticus species. So yeah, so those are the things that we can talk after the talk. But yeah, please let us know if you have taxonomy work for Ticus species complex.
Yeah, absolutely, Navneet. And I actually did find your work. So that's super to hear that there's some overlap, although it's always unfortunate for the growers, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we could not find very many studies in the literature. So it's helpful to have a partner who is actively working on Ticus species so that we can learn together about this insect and develop some management strategies.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that sounds good. And I have to step away from this meeting shortly, but I will be back, I'm hoping right at noon, if people have questions. And I see that there is another question, but I'm thinking I should type a response in terms of this burning question. Or maybe someone's just recommending. Anyways, we probably should pass the baton on.
Thank you very much for the questions, and thank you, Jennifer. On that note, I am going to turn it back over to Calvin to introduce our next speaker here.
Hey, thanks again, Jennifer. That was really good. It was a really good update. Exactly what we wanted. So our next speaker is Dr. Nidhi Kanal. Nidhi has actually he's the forward seat scientist at the Beaverlodge Research Station with AAFC. And I think Nidhi has been with us for 5 or 6 years now. And he's developed a lot of different research projects in terms of forward seed production at the station. And he's also really good, like he helped us out kind of developing our treatment lists and stuff like that we're doing out in producers fields and so forth. So he's a wealth of knowledge for a lot of that stuff. So anyways, today we I guess Nidhi wanted to give a bit of an update on some of the work that they've been doing at the station in terms of using growth regulators on some different grass seed crops. So with that in mind, I'll pass it over to Nidhi.
Good morning, everyone. This morning I'm presenting some results of plant growth regulatory studies conducted at Beaverlodge Research Farm from 2015 to 2021. I'd like to give credits to major contributors to this study. Calvin Yoder, who took major stake in this study throughout. Jennifer Otani was project lead in the previous phase of the project. Nobur Rahman compiled the results for for this presentation. Vishnu Pandey is working on a graduate project on plant growth regulator. He is a graduate student. Talan Gautir has been a collaborator and contributor throughout since last phase of this project until now. So first of all, I would like to give background to what is actual yield and how those yield improvement occur in our system, and the potential yield that we talk about for any cultivar, and that is determined by its inherent genetics, and cultivar carry that genetic potential through seed, and the environment exerts some limiting factors to realize that potential yield, and actually only part of that potential yield can be realized in the form of actual yield. And in that level, there is a way to improve. There are ways to improve both genetic potential and environmental compatibility, and breeding is the approach that enhances genetic potential of the crops that we grow, while the agronomy that includes crop and cropping systems management, including crop rotation, nutrient management, crop protection, irrigation, plant growth regulation, and so on. And these practices create favorable growing condition for realizing the genetic potential by reducing, overcoming yield limiting and yield reducing factors, and providing optimal growing conditions to realize the genetic potential of the cultivars. So that way the actual yield is much bigger because of more favorable interaction between genetic potential and the environmental condition. So what is the role of plant growth regulators in realizing yield potential, in enhancing the actual yield levels? So plant growth regulators are synthetic compounds that interfere with hormonal status of plants and affect their physiological processes. So the plant growth regulators that are used in forage seed crops are actually plant growth retardants that inhibit cell division and cell elongation, and their intended use is to control plant height, reduce lodging, and improve seed yield and quality. So there are two major groups of plant growth regulators being used in forest seed crops. Those are ethylene releasing compounds and inhibitors of biosynthesis, gibberellin biosynthesis. Ethylene and gibberellins are classical plant hormones that have a diverse role in plant growth and development through genetic reprogramming, gene expression, and plant metabolism. So our research questions for the plant growth regulatory studies are three sets. The first one is, do plant growth regulator reduce lodging and enhance seed yield and quality in our environmental conditions? For this, we have been conducting experiments in the field since 2015, and our research question that we are addressing with the current ongoing some lab and um, outside compound, which we call mesocosm study, is what physiological mechanism do plants growth regulators affect, such as light use efficiency, photosynthetic pigmentation, photosynthetic efficiency, growth parameters. We are studying these by using various methods. And third research question is, do plant growth regulators have stress priming effect? And for that, we are using measure two groups of studies. One is electrolyte leakage assay, and second is antioxidant enzymatic assays that we are hoping to do in the coming season, utilizing our mesocosm study trial. And major focus of my presentation today is seed yield response of plant growth regulators on creeping red fescue, meadow broom grass, and timothy. That is because of the interest of time. I do not have time to cover additional preliminary results that we are getting. So experiments, as I mentioned, I'm covering the experimental results of 2015 to 2021 on 3 test crops, creeping red fescue, meadow broom grass, and timothy, and 3 plant growth regulators being tested are trinexapac ethyl, chlorquat chloride, and ethapon. So these trinexapac ethyl and chlorquat chloride are inhibitors of gibberellin biosynthesis, and the third growth regulator, ethapon, induces ethylene production in plants, that way influencing various aspects of growth and development in plants. For experimentation, we have a series of experiments. 2014 establishment, and we currently have mesocosm experiments established last year, and we have also greenhouse studies going on currently. And I'm presenting the results starting from the 2014 establishment on creeping red fescue. There were 10 sets of treatments and different factors for comparison included are different levels of trinexapac ethyl with UAN as a top dress fertilizer, and 2 stages of application, those growth stages of crops, 2 node stage and heading stage application, and no application of plant growth regulator with UAN and without UAN, that is a standard check. The results are close to significance level, and but not quite there. And for having a significance level, we need 5% error level. That means we must be 95% confident. And so in this, we should call that the results were non-significant, but some of the plant growth regulator applied treatments had numerically higher yield than standard check. So same set of experiment conducted on creeping red fescue with the establishment of 2015, and combined results of 2016 and 17 also shows non-significant difference between the cultivars, although there is quite low yield in UAN applied treatment, and the check had similar level of yields as plant growth regulator treatments. On meadow broom grass, same set of experimental treatments. Here also, although results look little divergent, the results are not yet significant. The differences between the treatments are not significant. Only UAN applied treatment at relatively high concentration level of trinexapac ethyl, that is 0.3 kg/AI per hectare, that had that exceeded numerically in yield from the check level. So same set of experiment on meadow broom grass established in 2015, and combined results of 2016 and 17 still shows non-significant difference between the treatments, but most of the plant growth regulator treatments had lower yield here, especially all heading stage applied treatments had lower yield than the check, numerically lower yield, although statistically not significant, while two node stage application, one low rate of trinexapac ethyl and one higher rate with UAN application had numerically higher yield than the check treatment without plant growth regulators. Next is Timothy crop with the same set of treatments, and here the results are more interesting and significant. First year of the performance of the crops, in that all trinexapac ethyl applied at two node stage performed significantly better than all heading stage and UAN applied treatment and check, though check did not differ significantly with the high yielding from the high yielding plant growth regulator treatments, while UAN applied treatment without plant growth regulator and plant growth regulator at heading stage had significantly lower yield than two node stage and check treatments. So same set of a trial on Timothy established in 2015. Here the treatment differences occurred only between the treatments two node stage application of trinexapac ethyl with UAN and the treatment without any plant growth regulator. Those two treatments differed significantly, and with plant growth regulator at relatively high concentration of trinexapac ethyl had significantly higher yield than UAN itself, but somehow the results did not differ significantly from the check. In 2017, we conducted a little bit different set of experiments with two plant growth regulators, trinexapac ethyl and chlorine chloride, with the rate which were considered general standard for trinexapac ethyl and chlorine chloride, and one treatment comprised of half rates of those each, and one is check. And here we can see the combined trinexapac ethyl and chlorine chloride treatment had numerically higher yield and quite close to significance level if we consider 10%, and at 10% level it is significant, but we still for 5% level of significance there is no significant difference in the yield on creeping rate fescue. And we continued this combination of treatments, combination of plant growth regulator application in various integrated crop management trials, and I extracted some results from different years of integrated crop management trial here for comparison. And no plant growth regulator applied treatments, and the combination of trinexapac ethyl and chrome chloride. Here we did not see any significant difference between those treatments in three sets of trials established in 2018 and 2019 on creeping rate fescue. And same set of treatments we imposed on meadow broom grass. Here the results are little bit different, close to significance level at 2018, but not quite significant difference at 5% level. But in 2019 established two sets of experiment. those plant growth regulator treatments with trinexapac and chrome quat chloride had significantly higher yield than the control treatment. So with the same set of comparison on Timothy crop on the 2018 and 2019 established 3 sets of experiments. Only one set of experiment established in 2019 had significant effect, and in that trinexapac and clone quat combined application had significantly higher yield than the PGR, non-PGR applied treatments, no PGR treatment. So with those similar set of treatments, and we conducted experiment on creeping red fescue cultivars using 3 cultivars of creeping red fescue, brain, boreal, and oracle. With that 2 years of results in 2019 and 2020, those results show that treatment differences are still non-significant for cultivars and non-significant for plant growth regulator. And following year in 2019, we established same set of experiments, and we have results of 2020 and 2021. Still here also cultivar differences were non-significant, and plant growth regulator treatment were also non-significant here. With creeping red fescue, there are parallel other set of experiments we established in 2018 and 2019 from both years of results for first year and second year harvest combined analysis showed that there was no significant difference between the treatments for seed yield. And on meadow broomgrass also, we had similar treatments, and in 2018 and 2019 established crops and results of 3 years and results of 2 years of 2019 seeding. So the 3 years results of 2018 establishment showed significant difference between the treatment, but unfortunately here, trinexapac had the lowest yield, significantly lower yield than the check, while in 2019 established experiment, there were no significant difference between the treatments. On Timothy, also no significant difference in both sets of experiments with combined results of multiple years. And while with those, I'd like to summarize the results here of those seed yields. Yield responses to plant growth regulator were weather dependent, and sometimes there were good response, sometimes not favorable response of plant growth regulator application. In favorable condition, Timothy showed better response than creeping red fescue and meadow broomgrass to plant growth regulators. Combined application of trinexapac and chrome quat chloride hold promise and need further studies for refining their combination. Now I'd like to discuss our yield levels at Beaverlodge Research Farm in comparison to ryegrass yield trend in New Zealand. And those are interesting comparisons. In New Zealand, this is the case of different ryegrasses, Italian perennial and hybrid ryegrass. And yield trend shows from 1990 to 2015, quite a rapid increase in yield levels. And these equation here show that annual increment in yield were from 36 kilogram to 46 kilogram per year. And that advancement is attributed to influx of new cultivars, high nutrient input, and intensive crop protection regime, irrigation, that is measure one, and plant growth regulation on top of those intensive crop management measures. While at Beaverlodge, the case of creeping rate fescue, these results were extracted from cultivar testing trials from 2002, 2016, 17. And here we can see Boreal as a constantly good performer, and there is a slight trend of increase in yield over time. That is about 9 kilogram per year. We see that yield increase in Boreal, and yield of the mean trial yield. And for the second year crop performance, we see the declining trend here. And so if we combine first year and second year yield trend, and we see here really static yield, and there is no yield increase going on. And so what are those factors that are holding us at the static level in yield? And that is, one of them is limited cultivar options that we have, and we do not have irrigation to control moisture level in the soil and to combat drought. What is usually the common phenomena at different stages of the crop. And regarding the cultivar option, and I try to search the number of registered cultivars of creeping rate fescue in Canada, and only the website of Canadian Food Inspection Agency gave Boreal as the only sole cultivars with national registration, and that was registered in 1966, several decades ago. So yeah, cultivar options are very limited, although there are new emerging cultivars coming up in different cultivar trials from different companies, and hopefully they will be adaptive in our system. So the cultivar options in New Zealand, here you can see rapid increase in cultivars released for production in New Zealand. So if you talk about the rye grasses, and by 2010, there were over 150 cultivars available for production. So here, extracting results from our cultivar testing, and showing the relationship with the precipitation, it shows that with every milliliter of precipitation, there is about 3 kilogram yield advantage. Shows that well-distributed precipitation, especially during May and June, that is most critical for creeping rate fescue. And the more precipitation there, and there is high chance of greater yield. So this is a little bit additional aspect of that, and correlation between the precipitation and seed yield. And if you see the arrows with blue letters there, those are a precipitation relationship between seed yield and precipitation in May and June. All there you see highly significant, very strong positive correlation between the rainfall and seed yield. And that means moisture at certain growth stages of the crop is major limiting factor. Further reinforce that type of relationship, those analysis is the result of studies conducted by preceding scientist Nigel Ferry, that shows that if there is increase in precipitation from the long-term average, that is 459 millimeter, to up to 50%, that is 689 millimeter. That results in nearly 50% increase in yield. And if we had that control on soil moisture with irrigation, maybe our plant growth regulator response could be like this. This is my just imaginary line, and there would be better response of the crops with plant growth regulator and nutrient and plant protection regime. So with this, I'd like to conclude that further studies are needed. And so for plant nutrient management, and there have been centuries of research there, and still research continuing. And I feel that further studies are certainly needed on plant growth regulators to understand physiological mechanisms of plant growth regulatory effects and understand plant growth regulators' interactions with plant nutrients to influence the yield and to determine effect of combination of different plant growth regulators. And we need to explore the use of plant growth regulator to induce acclimation to stress, control regrowth in the fall, and resultant legacy effects on the following season crops. With that, I'd like to acknowledge the funding from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and Fisheries and Forest Seed Association, and expertise and technical support from colleagues and collaborators, Rahman Aziz, Pat Gansel, Mike Layton, Henry Klein Gibbing, and several casual staff and summer students who contributed to the project. With that, thank you so much.
Okay, was there any questions for Nydia?
Take one or two questions for Nydia before we move into our AGM. So feel free to pop them in that chat button or click that raise hand and we'll turn your microphone on and you can ask them a question. Here's a question from Fred. What research is there for new cultivars of fescue?
Thank you so much. And we have just initiated a project with some population improvement work on creeping red fescue since 2018. So yeah, that is very, very still I would call it a rudimentary stage. And so we have just completed one selection cycle. And so we produced in isolated tunnels in the field some polycross seeds out of them. And we have planted nursery in the greenhouse with those seeds produced last year. And we are going to establish new selection nursery in the field coming season. And I would say publicly breeding programs across Canada, no one is now like doing breeding work, special focused breeding work on creeping red fescue. So even though it is a very small scale, we are the only one now started working on breeding aspect of creeping red fescue here at Beaverlodge.
Great. Thank you for that question, Franz, and Nydia for the answer. We have time for one more question quickly before we go to the AGM. So one last question. Again, that raise hand function is at the bottom of your screen, right to the right of the chat button. Calling one last time for a question. Any questions for Nydia? All right. Well, if there are any questions that come in, I'm sure you'll be around for a little bit to answer them in the chat, Nydia. Thank you again.
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much.
No problem. And on that note, I believe we are going to transition to Danny to kick off the AGM for today. Just get him on here.
Okay, I think we're going to chop and get at it. Sorry.
Nope,
I'll try
that's
to get
perfect.
it over with. Maybe let everybody know again, and this is video. If I'm right, Alan, we're gonna put the presentations on the web, but we will not be putting the AGM on the web because
it'll be available to email out to people is what it is, because it's a big, yeah. So I'll be able to share the recording with anyone who asks for it.
perfect. That'll work good. It's nice that it's not all over the world with the internet. And at the end, we're supposed to wrap up around 1 o'clock. If we are late on that, I have no problem. Technically, the AGM is over, but if people want to stick around and give general comments, that would be great. And maybe I think that'd be great if we have more questions. So I guess I have to, is it you or you? I'll introduce Calvin, I guess, sorry.
Nope, that's okay. And I think I messed up on the script, but we wrap up around 1:30 today. So
Perfect.
So I'm going to introduce Calvin Yoder, which needs no introduction at all, but is the joint forage seed specialist between our association and Sarda Ag Research. And he's going to give a presentation on the forage seed agronomy work that he's been doing.
So I'm Calvin Yoder, and my work as a forage seed specialist under contract with the Peace Region Forage Seed Association and Sarda Ag Research. And what I do today is just give a bit of an overview of some of the projects we've been working on this past summer, obviously, and even going back a year or two to show some of the results and highlight some of the things that we've been working on. Doing some of our plot work in growers' fields and stuff like that. So, like most of you are aware, your grass seed growers or clover seed growers or forage seed growers in general. 2020 was a very miserable year with things dry. We actually had some really nice sites for most of our trials, or all of the trials for the most part. But just because of the dry weather, they obviously affected some of our trials. Just when you get these kind of dry conditions and stuff like that, you start to get a lot of variability within the plots or the trials, just in head emergence and just all kinds of stuff that don't really relate back to what the treatments went on. So we definitely, we went through the process of, doing all the treatments, doing all the work in our trials in our farmers' fields, we're taking them right to harvest and everything. But at the end of the day, we did have to scrap a couple of them, which is unfortunate just because the data was just way too variable and really wasn't showing treatment effects, more just like variability in the stand because of the year. So, and unfortunately, two of them, well, some of them were on creeping red fescue, which I was really excited about this year because we had some really nice sites. Anyways, today we'll talk about, I'll give a brief overview of give a bit of an update on some of the growth regulator work we've been doing on the brome grasses and creeping red fescue, talk a little bit about the fungicide Nexicorn creeping red fescue, herbicides on perennial ryegrass, establishing perennial ryegrass within vigor canola, which seems to be a growing trend right now. I'll talk a little bit about group 1 herbicide resistant wild oats, as that seems to be popping up more and more each year. Just a bit of an update on some of the recent minor use registrations that were put through last year and this year. And if we have time, just a quick list of the projects that we'll be looking at going forward with in 2021. So we've been doing a lot of work with growth regulators. You've heard a lot of this stuff probably the last number of years like this, and even moving forward, I'm sure over the next 4 or 5 years we'll be doing more work with them. There's just we're learning some things, but there's probably a lot more to learn as well. And I think they do have a fit on some crops, but it's just kind of sorting out kind of what rates and treatments and so forth that maybe give us the most consistent yield increase anyways, year in, year out on some of these different grass species are growing. Right now there's 2 products registered in Canada now that we're working with on grass seed crops. The one is Modus, which is Trinexpec ethyl, and throughout the talk you'll see it named TE. It's a Syngenta product that was registered last winter or last November, I guess, for use on wheat, oats, and barley. And it would be the main one that's used worldwide on grass seed crops. Again, when we talk about Oregon, New Zealand, Denmark, Europe, where, those main grass seed growing areas, growth regulators, particularly Modus, are just a standard application on their grass seed crops. But they are environments where there's lots of moisture, lots of fertility and so forth. Their crops lodge. And yeah, it's a standard practice, and they certainly get some significant yield increases by using them on their grass seed crops. Manipulator, I don't think it's used a lot on grass seed crops worldwide. I do know in some of the main Timothy seed growing areas, like say Sweden or Denmark, Norway, up in those areas, I do believe it is used to some degree. But on a lot of the other grass seed crops, I don't think it's really used that much, although there is a little bit of work going on in Oregon now with Manipulator on some of their grass seed crops. But by far, Modus is the most popular one used across the world. So when we're doing our trials, when we started up our trials, we've been looking at Modus or TE by itself. We've been looking at Manipulator or chlormacquat chloride, the CCC by itself, and also the mix of TE and CC at kind of half rates or a third rates type of thing. There seems to be some synergy when you put those 2 together, and you get some really significant, it works quite well, and almost too good in some cases, and yet can actually be a fairly economical treatment because we're cutting the rates of both of them and mixing them together, and there is some synergy there that really has some effects on the grass seed crops, at least up here. Then we put them on at 2 different stages, kind of the 2-node stage and then early heading or in around there. And we try and make those applications probably 10 days apart, just to give us a time frame between the 2 applications. So in terms of all of these treatments, in most years, almost every year, they are quite effective in reducing plant heights and lodging, and that's why we're using them, just to reduce any issues with lodging, especially when we get into wet years. They've all been generally fairly effective at reducing plant heights and lodging in fescue, Timothy, brome grasses. By far, the mix of the T and CCC is most effective, followed by Modus or T by itself, and then followed by Manipulator. Like I said earlier, the mix sometimes is maybe is actually a very effective, and we can get the price down, and maybe we can, with some lower rates, we can even get it down more than what we've been doing. But it can be a fairly harsh treatment, especially when the crops are under stress or getting into some dry years. So we do have to watch that a little bit with that, on some species anyways. The Manipulator it can be effective. It may not be always quite as effective in terms of reducing plant heights and helping with lodging compared to the Manipulator or the Modus, or sorry, the Modus or the mix. But it's definitely a lot gentler, safer on the crops if we do get into some stress conditions. At the end of the day, how these products work is really going to depend on the species that we're using it on, the age of the stand, yield potential, fertility, and moisture. So I want to just share the brome grass stuff, because it's, that's where we actually have quite a few trials now. I had to kick out because the data wasn't so good, or things didn't pan out quite well. Like this year we lost a site, but I just picked out the really good trials that I feel really comfortable presenting about, and the data was good, everything went well. But anyways, the cost on the growth regulator treatments that we've been using on brome grass for the Modus generally is, we're putting it on at 700 mil rate, and that's about $25 an acre. The Manipulator, we've kind of monkeyed around from 700 mils to a liter an acre. At a liter an acre, that costs about $23 an acre. cost of that. And then the mix, when we mix the two together at kind of reduced rates, actually comes out around $15 an acre. So something like that is getting a little more economical. This is one of the first years where we started doing some of these trials on farmers' fields, and this is just a nice shot. This is a really good year. Moisture stand, nice solid stands, fertility, and this usually shows manipulator that was put on at early heading. I think this was actually only at 700 mils an acre, and versus the check. And you can see the yields that we got on those plots, and we definitely had a nice yield increase from manipulator, putting it on meadow brome grass stand. There has been some farmers monkeying around with it already too. This was a field up in Fairview in 2020, and you guys can all go back to 2020. It was really wet. All our grass seed crops lodged. It rained all summer. And he was quite fortunate. We had talked about it in the winter. He did end up doing the majority of, this was actually on hybrid brome grass, and he ended up doing the majority of his hybrid brome grass fields. And this was just a drone shot on one of the fields where he left a check, and it worked really good that year. I think where the check was, where he actually didn't use it, I don't think he got hardly anything off there in terms of seed yield. Whereas where he had put down the manipulator, he actually pulled off a fairly decent crop for the year anyways. So I just put, this was the sites put together. This is actually a slide that shows the results from both meadow brome grass and smooth brome grass, kind of lumped all the sites together, and it just shows % of it that they check for each site using manipulator and putting them on at 2 different growth stages. And basically, if you look over the, what is that, 4 or 5 years now, where we've had these trials out, we've had some nice responses with manipulator in terms of improving seed yields. And when you start to see these trends over a number of years, and they're all higher than the check, you're starting to feel pretty good about what you're dealing with here. And I think when I took a bit of an average of the yield increase from over the check of these trials, and I think we came out with, I think it was like 12 or 13% higher in yield. But again, you can see a range maybe from no benefit to using it to up to 30% yield increase. So I think when you start to see these kind of trends, there's something to be said about at least considering you're looking at using a growth regulator like manipulator on brome grass seed crops. This like I said earlier, they if you get into years where maybe moisture conditions aren't so good, or maybe the crop's affected by something else, or maybe the stand doesn't turn out quite as good as what we think it might be, we can get into some issues, especially with some of the growth regulators that are maybe, we call them a little more effective on a grass seed crop, like Modus by itself, or the mix. And this was a site in 2019 down in White Mud on a smooth brome grass field. It actually was a really nice stand, but it just, I don't know, it just didn't produce like it should have, or it was a first year stand, just didn't do as well as what we should have did. But basically, I'm just showing that we did get some seed yield losses with the Modus or the mix compared to the check. With the manipulator, it might have seen a slight yield loss, but for the most part, it was pretty similar to the check. So regardless of which stage of application we put it on. So I guess just finishing up with the stuff on the brome grass, I do feel that manipulator is going to have a nice fit on brome grasses. We're going to do a couple more sites this year. I'd encourage anybody that grows brome grass to try some of this, at least with the manipulator, because I feel it looks like it can be of benefit and yet be a fairly safe product to apply. And not to say those other products like the Modus alone or the mix won't eventually use on brome grasses, but I just want to generate a little more data over a couple of years before we get too far with them. And it's really deceiving. This year I really learned too, and I get caught into it too, is these growth regulators can really whack the crop pretty good, and if it stays fairly dry after them later into the summer. And this is just a perfect example. Don't always get caught up in just what it looks like. We're not in the business of growing we're in the business of growing seed, not so much forage for the most part. unless you're really concerned about your straw. But this was over in Valhalla on a second-year brome grass stand, actually a pretty nice crop for the year anyways. And, this shows on the check, our average yields were, close to 400 pounds an acre, but with the mix there, we were, 430 pounds or kilograms per hectare. So very similar yields. I'd probably call them the same, but you can just see how poor, or just when you look at that stand where the mix went on of the growth regulator, and it whacked it really good and still pretty evident. And it just shows they might look miserable, if you get into some stress conditions or whatever, but it doesn't always mean it's going to be a seed yield loss. So with the creeping red fescue, a little bit more of a story, hasn't responded. Hasn't been quite as responsive to growth regulators maybe as some of the other crops, but we still keep working on it because we do get into a lot of years where fescue does lodge. So again, the treatments we've been looking at on fescue have been, Modus by itself at 700 mils, which is about $26 an acre. The manipulator, and then again, a mix of Modus and manipulator. Again, kind of half rates, cut rates, I guess, a little bit of each, I think. And that one that we've been working with comes out to about $28 an acre. So that one's a little more expensive than the other ones, but it's also been one of the more effective ones on fescue. So we've had a couple sites now looking at these treatments in growers' fields. Again, we put these treatments down at the 2-node stage and early heading. So do 2 different stages of application. This is just a picture. 2020, as you recall, was a really wet year. Crops were lodged. This was a site down in White Mud on a grower's field where we had a really nice growth regulator trial, and you can see the benefits of putting it on that year. Kept the crop standing really well, and we had really nice responses from using any of the growth regulators on the fescue crops in 2020 anyways. 2021 was definitely a little different story. So this is a similar slide to what I did for the brome grasses, just kind of took the sites that I feel really good about the data over the last, I guess that's 3 years now. And just again, showing the percent yield increase over the check treatments for those particular sites. And in 2019, we didn't get much of a response at all from putting them on, and I'm not sure why. That was actually a fairly wet year as well, and it was a really good stand. 2020 was a great year where we've seen some really huge yield increases, and that's what really got us excited. Again, 2021, there were, we did have issues with 2 of the 3 sites. The Eosham site actually was a really nice site. The data's not too bad, but we did lose a site in Heights that was just really good. I thought we'd get some nice responses, but it just didn't pan out because the variability in the head emergence in that stand really wasn't good. It was pretty nasty, actually. So anyways, and in Valhalla on a second-year stand, we actually got a seed yield loss from this application. So it just shows some of the variability that can happen sometimes, between maybe first and second-year stands. Also, just depending on what the year's like. So we definitely want to move forward with some more trials in fescue. I'm hoping we can get up at least another 3 fairly good packages in terms of where to move forward with that. Again, this is just a shot of where we put we had this growth regulator on a second-year field of in Valhalla, and it's one, as a grower, we wanted to spray because it was so dry in the spring. It wasn't going to be a high-yielding stand, just because it was a big crop the year before, and then dry conditions this year. But with that treatment, we actually did get a yield loss. We actually lost 125 kilos per hectare, 125 pounds per acre with that treatment over the check. So, and it did look fairly ugly as well. This is the same site there. Like I say, with the mix, we did get a seed yield loss, but with the other 2 treatments, just the Modus alone and the manipulator, the CCC, we actually didn't. It might have been a trend for a slightly lower yield, but when we run the stats, there really wasn't any difference between those treatments. So it was more the mix that caused the seed yield loss. We actually had a couple, and there were some guys that tried some on their fescue this year for sure, some strips and stuff like that. So I haven't talked to everybody that's done it, but you know, where we did put this mix down on fescue this year in 2021 dry year and stuff, they didn't look good at all. And same, we did have two growers, or did work with two growers and getting some of this mix of the Modus and Manipulator out on their fescue this year. They were both first year fields, actually fairly decent. One up with Tobin up in Flat Rock, and one with Gary Sanoski over in Eaglesham. Sprayed some strips of the mix. I think the Flat Rock one went on fairly early at the 2-node stage. Eaglesham was probably more into early heading. They really didn't look good, especially the Eaglesham one where that treatment went down. But we did take the weigh wagons out there and it did some yields, and it was surprisingly, the yields actually weren't that bad. They were actually similar to the Czech. So it was kind of interesting, and it just goes back to the whole thing that even though these things may be harsh on a crop in some years, they look like they're going to cause a seed yield loss. They may not, but again, there has been years where we've seen that where we have seen some seed yield loss on some species. So I think it really did show what it was just nice to have some field skill results to kind of back some of this stuff up as well. And it'd be nice if we can continue on with some of the stuff next year. Just a slide or two on the fungicide Nexicor on creeping red fescue. We've actually done some work with it on a couple grasses starting in 2020. Again, 2021 wasn't so good just because of the year, but we'll do stuff again in 2022. It's the cereals. The application, there has been growers, particularly in the southwest part of the Peace Lake in the Beaverlodge Heights Hall area, that do use the fungicide headline as a standard practice when their application on their creeping red fescue in the springtime, just mixing in with their herbicide when we're spraying in the springtime. Nexicor is a little different than headline. It has one of the active ingredients that is in headline, but it's actually just got two other active ingredients as well, and it does suppress a number of cereal leaf diseases. At this point in time, we don't have any forages on the label, but maybe with time we'll change that. The rate is about 200 mils an acre, and that would cost you about $14 to $15 an acre to put it on. The reason I brought this one up is, we had some really nice responses in 2020, when we had those wet years, good data, and basically we had some significant, we had nice yield increases with it, at the 3 sites where we tested it. In 2021, we tested it on that second year field of fescue at Valhalla that I had mentioned earlier. And we didn't see very much difference with it there, but in the previous years we did. And I guess with the price of fescue the way it is, a $15 treatment of a fungicide, and might be something to look at. It probably wouldn't take too much to pay off, especially if we get into some conditions this year where maybe we have some decent moisture to work with. So just going to switch gears now and talk about perennial ryegrass. Perennial ryegrass, the seed years have been increasing steadily over the last number of years, particularly with Foster's placing quite a few acres. So starting to get more questions on, establishment and weed control and all those sorts of things. So in terms of, I thought I'd just put one slide on, just an update on where things are at in terms of herbicides on seedling and established perennial ryegrass. We haven't done a lot of work up here yet with herbicides on established ryegrass, so a lot of the work has come out of maybe Saskatchewan or Manitoba. I think we will start to do more definitely as if the acres continue to stay where they're at, and it looks like they will be. So we'll actually do more work with it down the road. But for broadleaf herbicides, whether it's seedling or established, there are a few minor use registrations. It's Infinity FX, and I think that's a lot that the guys, those are both products that are used quite a bit on ryegrass. MCPA 240. And then we did get a minor use registration for Stellar on perennial ryegrass for both seedling and established. I think that's a really nice product on ryegrass, especially on established. I think it's a very nice option. Then the other ones that would have potential but aren't registered, but the actives are generally going to be safe, or are going to be safe on them, would be something like a Prestige, a Curtail M, Curtail M plus Ferlazum, which is the Spectrum, which is a nice mix. Spectrum isn't available anymore, but those two actives are the same thing that was in it. Enforcer M and MC Piestrin Florazanum, which is Frontline, which I don't think they make Frontline anymore. There's some different products you can buy for that, but those are probably the main ones that we'd be looking at. Unfortunately for wild oat control, there's nothing new. Anytime there's something new to try, and then we are doing some screening work with a few other products, but on perennial ryegrass in grass seed crops in general, but the only one is Puma Advance, and it's that's all we have. So pretty limited on wild oat control in ryegrass. And the other issue too is, we're seeing more Group 1 resistant wild oats pop up across the Peace Country and in our stands or in our fields. And Puma is one that, for the most part, if you've got some Group 1 resistance, Puma's likely isn't going to work on them. So we do get into a bind there. Corteva has a nice group of products: Pixero, Paradigm, Supreme, Prominix. They have an active ingredient called Arlex or haloxifin in there. Really good on cleavers, and they're very nice products. You have to be a little bit cautious with it. I haven't seen any data with this stuff yet, for the most part on established ryegrass anyways. I'm hoping we can do some work this year with them, but that one active ingredient they have in there does have some activity on grass, like I think it's barnyard grass. And so you have to be, before I wouldn't use any of these on ryegrass until we actually do some trials, because I know we're doing work with these products on creeping red fescue and Timothy, and they've looked okay, but on brome grasses, established brome grasses, I wouldn't use them. I think we've seen some damage and actually some seed yield loss with them. So there seems to be some differences in how grasses may tolerate these products, these herbicides, and unfortunately they are actually very, very good products. They get a wide spectrum of weeds. On this, any work we've done with them on seedling grasses, we haven't seen an issue so far. But you just have to be cautious with it on established grasses, unless you've seen some good data with things. And like I say, on creeping red fescue and Timothy on established stands, they've actually looked okay so far. We'll talk a little bit about establishing perennial ryegrass. Been a practice that seems to be growing each year, and I think for the most part it works quite well. If I was putting some in, I think this is the way I would do it. There's a lot of benefits to it. I mean, when you're looking at establishing perennial ryegrass, there's probably 3 different ways you're going to look at doing it. One way, the traditional way or the standard way, has been to say underseed it with wheat, and take the wheat off and take your ryegrass off the year after. And it works good too. We typically get fairly nice ryegrass stands with wheat, but there are some, not issues, but there can be some problems with that. I mean, you don't have nothing to control any volunteer wheat the year after if you have volunteer wheat coming up in your ryegrass, and it can get competitive on it. If you've got some Group 1 resistant wild oats on that field, and you've got ryegrass and wheat together, the only thing you can spray is Puma Advance, and it's not going to get them if they're resistant to, if you have some wild oats that are resistant to Group 1 herbicides. So that's another issue. The other way too, if we get into a wet year and there's maybe some chem fallow or summer fallow that didn't get seeded, perennial ryegrass seems to work quite well if you get it in, maybe in middle of July to early August. Seems to work quite well, and get some fairly decent crops the year after, using that method. And then the other way that we're seeing more and more people probably adapt is looking at seeding perennial ryegrass with Invigor canola. And again, canola is a nice crop to seed any grass seed crop with, and and putting down some Liberty. Liberty's not always the strongest on grasses, and you know, using this system where we're seeding perennial ryegrass down with canola, Invigor canola, pretty much in the same seed row for the most part, seems to be working not too bad. And you know, and spraying it with Liberty to control the weeds, it seems to be working out all right. So we've done a couple trials with Dan Richards over in La Glace. He's been growing ryegrass for a few years now, and I think the last 2 years he's looked at using the system to establish his perennial ryegrass. In 2020 was again, you know, a really wet year. We put Liberty down at you know, pretty much maybe a couple different rates, 2 different stagings with the same application and that sort of thing. We did 1 tank mix with Liberty with Centurion, and you know, it was a good year. You know, you always see a little bit of damage on the ryegrass, but with all the moisture we had in 2020, that ryegrass grew out of any kind of damage that might have been there. And you know, after the canola was harvested and looking at the plots, we didn't see anywhere we put Liberty down. We didn't, whether it was 1 applications or 2 applications, and regardless of the rates we used, we didn't see any damage at all. So it was pretty impressive. The only one we got a lot of damage was when we mixed in some Centurion, and that's just to improve the grassy weed control, you know, on your wild oats or volunteer cereals, and it basically took the ryegrass right out. So tank mixing with something like Centurion or Assure to get better grassy weed control in your canola that's underseeded to ryegrass isn't going to be an option. This is just a picture showing some of those plants that year and from some of these different plots. You know, in summer, basically nice green plants. You can see at the bottom left where we put the Centurion and Liberty down together. There's basically maybe 1 plant or 2 plants left in that picture. And then, you know, where we went with actually Liberty at 1.35 liters per acre, but making 2 passes, you know, it looked really good. So again, a really wet year, and you know, ryegrass does really flourish with moisture, especially in that establishment phase. This is just a picture of the Centurion and Liberty showing, you know, how much it really reduced the stand of that ryegrass when it was sprayed during establishment. This is what the stand looked like. This was actually the farmer's field. He had sprayed some Liberty on it. The stand looked fantastic in the spring of 2021. You know, unfortunate we didn't get more moisture in 2021, because this would have been a very nice crop down in this part of the field. We did it again in 2020. We did the trial again in 2021, and pretty much seen similar results. I changed the rates up a little bit. We went with the higher rate of Liberty. We did see some damage, like when we assessed them in the summertime. You know, I assessed it at 30% visual injury, which is getting up there. And even after the canola was harvested, we did see some stand reductions with that high rate of Liberty, 2.7 liter per acre rate. And for some reason, with the 1.35 liter rate as well, where we put it on twice, we did note in a couple of the plots, we did see some stand reduction as well, which was a little bit surprising. Although again, it was a really dry year, obviously in 2021 as well. But the other treatment we put in this year too was faucet, which helps to give some cleaver control if you have cleaver issues in your canola. And you really didn't see any issues with that. And we had done some work many years ago with faucet, or Accord it was called then, on perennial ryegrass and seedling stuff, and the tolerance looked quite good. So that, if you're looking at the system and cleavers could be an issue, faucet might be one. You know, we'll do it again next year just to make sure, but faucet might be something you can consider to beef up your cleaver control. And these are just some pictures. You can see at the high rate on the left-hand side with on the ryegrass that was underseeded with Invigor canola, we got quite a bit of leaf burn, and like I say, I felt we had quite a bit of damage there with it. And another shot taken in the fall on the right hand side where the Liberty was put on in the springtime with the canola and ryegrass, and you can certainly see there is some, you know, we did have some stand reductions there and actually lost some plants. And I took a picture of the farmer's field. He actually, Dan actually sprayed Liberty at 1.6 liters per acre. He put it on at 2 different stages. And honestly, like, I mean, you could definitely see some damage. you know, some leaf burn and stuff like that. But that field looks fantastic, and he went with both those rates. So we'll see. There's more people doing it. We'll have more experience with it going into 2022 as well. But it sure seems like a nice system to look at using if you're going to be growing perennial ryegrass. The other part of it too, which again we'll do more of, is looking at the effects of, say, desiccants on perennial ryegrass seeded with InVigor canola. For most people that grow, you know, InVigor canola or any canola, I mean, straight combining is becoming more and more common. So, and that would be the case as well. I would assume if guys are seeding ryegrass with canola, we did on Dan's field there too. We just did a small plot trial there too, where we came in with some Reglone and heat. Both are desiccants that are registered on canola, and applied them, and left a check as well. We put them on, I think it was September 7th. It was about 80% seed color change in the canola. Then Dan just harvested right across the plots, whatever it was, you know, 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, or whatever it was, and came back and looked at them. We did see some injury with the Reglone. That's on the left-hand side there, just some leaf burn and stuff like that. And 30% is starting to be significant. 20% is what we call acceptable. So we definitely seen some leaf burn on those leaves and stuff like that. You could pick those plots out fairly easily, but again, that was in the fall. We'll have a look in the spring, and I think we'll do some seed yields on that as well. But with the heat, which it also you know, can help in terms of desiccating the canola down to get it off to straight combine it. We didn't see any visual damage at all, and that wasn't too surprising. Heat's actually registered on grass seed crops down in Oregon as a treatment alone. So that looks like it would be a treatment to look at that could help or would help with desiccating your canola to dry it down, to take it off straight and not have much effect, or not have any effect on the ryegrass underneath. So we'll repeat this again for another maybe year or two and just see if we get similar results. And again, have a look at them in the spring, even though we've seen some damage with the Reglone on that ryegrass in the fall, you know, after harvest, you know, maybe it won't be an issue next spring. So just to finish up with, I think I've got just a couple more slides, just to talk. I wanted to bring up another issue, and it's not like it's new, but you know, we seem to be seeing it more and more on not only creeping red fescue fields, but other grass seed fields across the Peace Country, is wild oats in our grass seed crops, in particular fescue. You know, as you guys fescue growers, we use Assure 2 a lot on our fescue fields, and we are starting to see more fescue fields, or you know, where you're seeding fescue down on some of these fields where we do have some group 1 resistant wild oats, and a lot of times it's resistant to a product like Assure. And that's what happened with this particular field here on the left. One thing to keep in mind, we've done work with Centurion many years ago, and it is really hard on fescue. Like, don't even think about using it, whether it's seedling or established. So just keep that in mind, because it if you sprayed on your established fescue, you likely won't have a crop. You know, it just really suppresses the head production, and it gets pretty nasty. The one reason I wanted to put this slide on is because it was mentioned to me that post ultra, you know, one thing about wild oats are kind of funny. Even though you'll have some group 1 resistant wild oats in your field, there are some group 1 chemistries that will still control them. So, you know, even though you have wild oats, group 1 resistant wild oats that are resistant to Assure, there may be an opportunity that post ultra would actually control them. So where growers have had issues with you know, resistant wild oats using Assure 2, some of them have switched to post ultra and hasn't worked too bad, and at least getting some of them. And the problem now is, it sounds like it is, I mean, talking to BASF, post ultra will no longer be available for use in field crops. I think it might still be available as a horticulture crop down in the US, or sorry, I mean in Eastern Canada. But it does kind of put a bit of a bind in us for us in terms of managing wild oats in our creeping red fescue crops, especially during establishment, where, that's the time where you really want to look after those wild oats and so forth. We have done work with Axial, and Axial may control some wild oats that are resistant to Assure too. And we do have registration for a minor use registration for the use of Axial on seedling creeping red fescue. It's very safe. Wouldn't see any issues there. We're actually going to test it on established fescue this year as well, and see what the tolerance is like, and get some of those kind of trials in. So the other thing too, just wanted to mention a little bit, we did collect some foxtail barley seed from 2 fields this summer, and actually submitted them this winter to AgQuest to check on potential resistance to Assure too. Just some of the fields I've seen over the last few years, it just seems like foxtail is more of an issue, and maybe we're not getting quite as much out of the Assure. So I do get concerned that we've probably overused Assure on our fescue fields too much, and we'll see what these come back as. They weren't ready for this meeting, unfortunately, so I couldn't talk about them, but we'll have some updates later this spring or summer on how those samples are. So if you suspect maybe you might have some issues with Assure controlling foxtail barley, maybe let us know. We can come out and grab some samples this summer and send them away to the lab. So, and we are doing work, managing wild oats and foxtail barley and grass seed crops. It's on the radar every year. Anytime there's some new products come out or other options we think might work, we're trying them. And we put in some trials last fall, and we'll be using some of this spring again, just looking at different, just trying to grab anything that might have some potential for use in grass seed crops to manage those 2 weeds. So just to finish up, registrations or minor use registrations that we've been involved with for the last number of years, that just came out in say 2020 or 2021. I just talked about Axial a little bit. It's a good wild oat herbicide registered for use in wheat and barley. And we did get a minor use for it. We did some work with it. We did get a minor use for it last year, I guess 2020, on creeping red fescue, meadow brome grass, and smooth brome, just on seedling crops. Don't use Axial on established brome grasses. We do get some seed yield loss with it, but it doesn't look too bad on seedling bromes, and fescue definitely it's fine on. So Infinity FX, we have used a lot of Infinity on our seedling and established, particularly our seedling stands of grass seed crops, and we now have fescue, timothy, meadow brome grass, smooth brome, and ryegrass on the Infinity FX label. It just gives you a little better control on things like buckwheat and cleavers and so forth over Infinity alone. Stellar was a great registration. This is a pretty neat one. Stellar's a nice product. When we first started doing work with it, it's an old product, it's been around for a long time. When we first started doing work with it, I thought it would mainly have a place just on seedling grasses, but we actually use it quite a bit now on even established brome grasses or timothy. It's even ryegrass. I think it has some good potential, wheat grasses, but we did get a minor use registration for it on pretty much any grass that we grow in Western Canada, because it is a very nice and safe product. So that was a pretty neat one to see, both seedling and established stands. We can feed the straw to livestock. It's all good. Those are nice registrations that we'd like to see more of. The other one that just came through too, like we did a lot of work with Express as a pre-seed burn-off before seeding, grasses like timothy and brome grasses and creeping red fescue, and also some of the legumes like Alsike, red clover, and alfalfa. So we actually had those on the Express label as a pre-seed mixed with Roundup already. But just with some work with Saskatchewan and some of the work we did up here this last year, we were able to get some more grasses and legumes added to the Express label, like the wheat grasses, a couple wheat grasses, meadow fescue, tall fescue, brome grass, hybrid brome, and sweet clover and sandfoin. So that was a good one. There's a minor use now for quilt for the control of disease and fescue grown for seed production. And although we did quite a bit of work with Travalis a number of years ago, it's a nice little mix of kind of Ally, Refine, and Fluroxapure. There's quite a few fescue growers that use it. Good on most weeds, except if you've got some group 2 resistant weeds like hawksbeard. It's not going to get it at all. But we just made that submission for established creeping red fescue. But yeah, I wouldn't recommend using it on seedling, but it's actually a pretty nice product on established fescue. And we just submitted it, so we would hope by next year that registration would be through. So, and then just moving forward, we just a bit of an update too. We do have a grass testing different varieties and some ryegrass. So if you're ever in that area, it's actually a nice site to look at. We harvested the fescue and wheatgrass their first years this last year in 2020. So Nydia is just finishing up that report right now and would be available fairly soon. Put some clover, some different clover varieties in, both Alsike and red clover, I think 4 varieties of each that we seeded this year. Seeded them pretty early in the spring, so there's a lot of growth on them. But we'll be taking those to seed yields in 2022 this summer and the year after. So those will be pretty interesting. And I think it's a nice site, and I think we have a little more room. We'll be putting some Timothy and wheatgrass and ryegrass varieties in there as well this coming summer. And just going forward with some of the projects, again, we'll be looking at this summer. We'll continue to do quite a bit of work with growth regulators on fescue, Timothy, and brome grasses. We're going to try a site on crested wheatgrass this year. Looking at herbicides Supreme and Prominix. Those are Corteva products on established fescue, Timothy, wheatgrasses, and maybe perennial ryegrass, or hopefully. We always do some seedling and pre-seed herbicide tolerance trials on a number of different grasses, usually at Beaverlodge. We'll do some work with we're going to start some trials with Axial, which is a good wild oat herbicide on established creeping red fescue and crested wheatgrass as well. Particularly interested in see how it will work on wheatgrasses like crested wheatgrass. We've got some trials looking at the residual type herbicides of Authority or Volterra on established clovers. Looking at Olympus as a pre-seed burn-off before seeding fescue and perennial ryegrass. It just gives a little bit of extra foxtail barley control and a little bit of residual for wild oats. So we'll start looking at that product a little bit more. Managing wild oats and perennial ryegrass. We'll do some more trials establishing perennial ryegrass with canola. We're doing some work with annual bluegrass. We got some funding finally to do some work in that. So we've got some tolerance trials out with some different herbicides, and also looking at how these herbicides might control annual bluegrass. It's getting them to be more, well, it's been an issue for a while, but it seems to be getting worse. And even guys that don't grow fescue, it seems to be popping up in fields. We do have some screening trials out that we started last fall for foxtail barley control and on wild oats and grass seed crops. We may be involved in a demo looking at a drone application for applying Lantrell over a grass seed field just to spot spray for thistle. I think it actually is kind of a neat idea or a neat concept. And yeah, and then like I say, we'll do some more work with establishing this ryegrass under canola. So, anyways, that's it. Again, thanks for everybody that helps do our work. The farmers, we have a good group of growers up here that allow us to come in and do work on their fields. We're always looking for nice, solid stands of fescue, Timothy, brome grass. Especially this year, if anybody does have some nice stands of fescue, I'd be interested in knowing. We've scouted a couple out last fall, but it's always nice to have a few more options. And that sort of thing to do these trials on. Nydia at Beaverlodge helps us out a lot. Talon's awesome. Vance at Sardi's a manager, and we've got a really good crew that help carry out a lot of these trials, like Amber and Vic and Megan at Sardi Research, Pat at Beaverlodge, and of course the growers for giving us an opportunity to work on their land and do these trials. So that with that, pretty much wraps it up. And yeah, if there's any questions, we can certainly take some.
Perfect. Okay, so we have discussed that we're going to actually lump Calvin's questions in at the end, because we always give Calvin too much to talk about, and it is such great information to share. So we're going to just move directly into Kristen's presentation. And so I will just do a quick introduction of Kristen. So she is a research microbiologist with the USDA Forage Seed and Cereal Research Unit in Corvallis, Oregon. And Nicole Anderson is also with us, and she'll be available during the question and answer period afterwards. And she's the Field Crops Extension Agent with Oregon State University. So Kristen's going to present to us on the work that they did around carbon sequestration in forage seed, so carbon stocks.
Hi, good morning. My name is Kristen Tripp. I'm a soil microbiologist for the USDA Agricultural Research Service. I'm housed at the Forage Seed and Cereal Research Unit in Corvallis, Oregon. We're co-located on the Oregon State University campus. I've been here for about 7 years, and I haven't done that much work in Canada, but I'm really excited to get to know you and to learn about your challenges growing grass seed in northern climates. The work I'm presenting today is a collaboration between myself and Amber Moore. We co-mentored a postdoc, Martina Gonzalez-Mateo, at Oregon State. And Martina was really interested in learning about how post-harvest residue practices impacted soil health in tall fescue. Now, she's also interested in sort of the reverse question, trying to understand if healthier soils returned higher yields. I don't have time to talk about those results, but I hope you'll keep an eye out for our publications in the next few months. Instead, I'm really going to focus on her work in carbon in tall fescue fields. Before I start talking, though, I want to take a moment to acknowledge our funders who supported this work. So specifically, the USDA and the Oregon Seed Council provided funding for this research. This whole group of people who are listed here provided technical support either in the lab or in the field, or they allowed us to access their lands. I also want to thank Nicole and Talon for asking me to speak today. I'm really excited to be here, and I can't wait to chat with you after the recorded presentation. Again, we were really interested in learning how carbon responded to post-harvest residue management practices under tall fescue. But before I get there, I just want to make sure everybody's on the same page. So first, what is soil carbon? Now, if you send a soil sample off to a lab, you'll likely get a result back that says you have a certain percentage of organic matter. In this case, I just made something up, 3%. Well, organic carbon is about half of that. So if you have 3% organic matter, you have 1.72% carbon. Now, to calculate a carbon stock, you have to take into account how dense your soil is. So if you have 1.72% carbon and you have a really compact soil, you're going to have a higher amount of carbon on a per acre or a per hectare basis than you do if you have a really fluffy soil, but you have the same amount of percent carbon. But why do we care about carbon at all? Well, carbon is a master soil health indicator. So if you have more carbon, you generally have soils that function in a way that have more plant available water, that retain nutrients, and that are more resilient to disturbance like flooding and tillage. So there's ecological reasons to want more carbon, but there's also economic and regulatory reasons for increasing carbon too. And no matter how hard we might want to, we really can't disentangle these reasons. What do I mean by that? So as an example, if you've got more organic carbon in your system, nutrients and pesticides tend to stay on site. That means they don't get washed away into streams, which is better for your plants, but it's also better for your pocketbook. It's also good for aquatic wildlife, and that means it's good for regulators who are trying to keep water clean. Now, in the very near future, carbon trading, whether it's something that's mandated by the state or whether it's part of a voluntary program, is going to be something that farmers need to think about. So adding more carbon to your soil could have a direct payment or an offset for your farm while helping with climate resilience and meeting carbon caps. Now, because carbon is so interwoven with fertility into water availability and productivity, it's something people have been thinking about for a really long time. And this isn't unique to seed production systems. Folks have been wondering how to increase carbon for many decades across many cropping systems. Now, interestingly, land use conversion to grasses is one of the fastest ways to build soil carbon stocks. If we look back through the literature, one of the fastest soil carbon accumulations ever observed was when peanut and cotton fields were converted to pasture with intensively managed grazing. In this case, the study reported a 75% increase in soil carbon stocks within 6 years of conversion. That turned out to be about 3.6 tons of carbon per acre per year, which is substantial. Now, this is because farming grasses inherently includes many of the soil practices that are important for building carbon and are important for soil health. This includes keeping the soil covered, reducing tillage, and returning roots and straws back to the system. So, okay, it's one thing to take cotton and flip it into pasture, but how can we build carbon in grass seed systems? Well, intuitively, as a researcher, my first instinct is to say, incorporate practices like no-till and residue return back into your farm. But at the same time, a lot of farmers, especially in the Willamette Valley, report that incorporating these practices results in a dramatic increase in pest and pathogen pressure, in weeds, and decreasing yields. So what are the trade-offs? Is the carbon that results from leaving the residue on the field worth the perceived economic cost? Before we can even start to think about quantifying these trade-offs, we need to know how much more carbon we can store when we incorporate these practices. So for example, to understand if the carbon gains outweigh the economic loss when a farmer stops baling, we need to know how much carbon straw is contributing to the system. Now this question is really nuanced. Does baling remove carbon from the soil? Now some groups have already studied this question and have learned quite a bit. So let's review what they've done. Steve Griffith was a researcher in my unit for several years, and he looked at baling in tall fescue as well as a number of other rotations. He found that carbon concentrations increased under full straw management compared to bale treatments in 6-year continuous tall fescue rotations. In other rotations and locations, baling had no effect on soil carbon. Similarly, a study by Mark Melby in annual ryegrass reported a small increase in organic matter of about 0.15% in the topsoil after 3 years with a full straw load compared to continuous baling. In contrast, so Hogan, who's a researcher at Oregon State University, carried out a survey across various soils in the Willamette Valley in 14 paired tall fescue fields. And half these fields were baled, or they had a history of full straw management. She found no differences between the two post-harvest residue management practices for total carbon. So, according to these studies, baling could have a negative effect on soil carbon, or it could have no effect on soil carbon. And that's unexpected because we know that baling removes thousands of pounds of residue from the field per acre. So if the carbon doesn't move into the soil, where does it go? And this is the question that we wanted to explore with Martina's study. Now, of course, carbon, from the atmosphere can move into plant shoots, then move into roots, and it can be translocated into the soil through exudates and biomass. Now, most studies have only looked at this top part of the soil to quantify the carbon, but we wanted to do a complete accounting. So we looked at all of the available carbon stocks, including the above ground biomass, the root biomass, the topsoil to 12 inches, and then the deeper soil profile to 39 inches, which is about 1 meter. We chose to do this in tall fescue because tall fescue covers a lot of ground in the Willamette Valley, about 150,000 acres. They also have generally long-lived stands, and so we could start to interrogate what happens when you first put in a tall fescue stand. Over the first 5 years, do you accumulate carbon, or do you have to wait longer? So we looked at 0 to 5 year stands, and we looked at 5 to 20 year stands. They also have an extensive root system, and so perhaps carbon is moving into those deeper soil profiles. So, the goal of this study was to assess the effects of stand age and straw residue management practices on carbon stocks in tall fescue fields. We hypothesized that older stands with chopped straw would have more carbon because the roots and shoots would provide more carbon to the soil, to the microbes, and this would help form stable aggregates that could sequester the carbon. Now, to explore this, Martina and her army of helpers sampled 24 tall fescue fields in the mid, the south, and the north Willamette Valley. These were paired fields, so we had 12 fields that were young, 6 of them were baled, 6 of them were chopped, and we had the same design in fields that were older. So again, in older fields, we had 12, 6 baled, 6 chopped. Now, I do want to mention that in the older fields, some were as young as 5 years old, and some were as old as 20 years. So there was a nice representation of different stand ages within that class. We also wanted to know how tall fescue compared to other systems. So we examined 3 undisturbed or uncultivated natural sites, and we sampled 3 annually tilled sites. Now for each of these sites, we collected 9 cores across 3 transects to get a nice sense of variability within and between fields. We also used an ATV mounted probe to collect samples to 39 inches, and then we used these cores to measure a variety of properties, including bulk density and total carbon. And bulk density and total carbon are the 2 values you need to calculate carbon stocks. We revisited the fields in late June to collect samples for roots and to collect above ground biomass. The roots were separated from the soil, and all the compartments, the soil, the plants, the roots, we tested those for carbon to calculate carbon stocks. We also measured a lot of other parameters that I don't have time to talk to you about today. So we analyzed the microbial community, soil aggregates, pH, fertility, and a whole suite of soil health metrics. Again, today we're just going to focus on the carbon. So what did we find? We found that in the topsoil, so this slide shows what happens in the top 12 inches, carbon stocks did not significantly change over time or with residue management. I know this is a bit hard to see, but the circles are carbon stocks in tons per acre in fields that have been baled, and the triangles are carbon stocks in fields in tons per acre in fields where straw has been left on the field. Now I'd like you to notice that there's quite a bit of variability in these data. Some of the fields that have full straw return have really high levels of soil carbon stocks. And some where the straw has been left on the field have really low carbon stocks. So perhaps one of the reasons we didn't see a trend within this data set is that there's an incredible amount of variability between fields within a treatment. The lack of a trend in carbon stocks is supported by the fact that when we aggregate the data and we look directly at percent carbon and bulk density, again, the 2 components that determine carbon stock, there's no differences between treatments. Now, given that, and given that the previous studies have shown very little differences in the topsoil between management practices, I was not surprised at this result at all. But I was really curious to see what was going on in the deeper soil profile. Here are the data for that deeper part of the soil profile. And the bottom line is that we saw a complete reiteration of what we saw in the topsoil. So again, deep soil carbon stocks did not significantly change over time or with residue management practices. Again, you see a lot of variability between fields within a treatment. This was really unexpected. So again, you don't see any differences when we look at percent carbon or bulk density in the lower soil. Now, to be fair, we have to look at the whole picture, right? So we wanted to see if there were differences in biomass or carbon stocks, again, considering the roots and the shoots. So here are 2 graphs of shoot biomass and carbon stocks. With shoots, we saw that the highest biomass, so the highest amount of plant matter, in young baled fields. But this did not result in significantly higher carbon stocks. But to be fair, we really have to take away the fields that were baled, because you can't consider carbon when it's exported from the field. So if we just compare young and old fields in carbon stocks in full straw residue, you can see that there's not any significant differences among age classes. Now, with root biomass, we looked to see if there were differences in biomass or carbon stocks in the roots. We did see that root biomass and carbon stock increased with stand age, but it was not affected by residue management. And you can see that in both of these graphs here. So, okay, we didn't see any differences in the topsoil. We didn't see any differences in the deep soil, the roots and the shoots among different post-harvest residue management strategies. But what happens when we add it all together? Do we see a difference? So here I have all of the above ground carbon stocks graphed. So basically the plant biomass on this upper graph and all of the below ground carbon stocks on this lower graph. The roots are in yellow, 0 to 12 inches are in light brown, and carbon stocks in 12 to 39 inches are in dark brown. Here I have everything graphed, and again, we need to be fair about this and remove the above ground carbon from the baled treatments. And when you do that, this is what it looks like. Did you catch that? Let me do it again. Right? It's noticeable, but there's much more carbon below ground than there are in the plants. And maybe this is why we don't see huge changes. Or maybe there's just enough variability that we can't capture differences. Now, if we want to look at raw numbers, it certainly looks like there's a trend over time, that there's more carbon in fields that have full straw. And it appears to come from some collective increases in shallow and deep carbon. But statistically, the differences aren't there. So from this study and from previous studies, we conclude that total carbon stock does not change with age or residue management practices. So to answer this question, does baling impact carbon stock? Not appreciably, not consistently, and there's too much variability to know for sure. So I think this is really good news for growers that want to bale their fields. But we still have more questions. Now, one thing we wanted to know in this study was, how does tall fescue compare to other systems? If perennial grass systems are the pinnacle of agricultural carbon sequestration, how are we actually doing in our fields? So to answer that question, we collected samples from natural, uncultivated sites and from annually disturbed fields. Average carbon stocks at the 0 to 12-inch depth differed across a land disturbance gradient. So for example, carbon in the undisturbed, uncultivated natural areas was much higher than it was in perennial tall fescue, which was much higher than it was in annually tilled crops from similar soil types. However, at the 12 to 39-inch depth, tall fescue and annually tilled crops had similar carbon stocks, and they were significantly lower carbon stocks than the uncultivated natural sites. Now, I love these data because they give us an idea on the potential of the system. And they tell me that growing tall fescue is actually working towards that potential in the topsoil. So what did we learn from this study? Average carbon stocks of tall fescue fields in the Willamette Valley were about 76 tons per acre. Soil carbon stocks were not affected by post-harvest residue management practices or by stand age. And perennial tall fescue fields had greater carbon stocks than in the topsoil than annually tilled fields, and were approaching carbon stocks in natural sites. But I'd like to propose, but I'd also like to make an overall conclusion that I think is a really important. We've been doing this research for a really long time, and in those 40 years of research, we've consistently shown that grass seed systems support high levels of carbon and soil health to provide ecosystem services. And no matter how hard researchers have tried to show that management practices that impact soil under corn or cotton or soybean, practices like tillage and residue removal, we've tried to show that those practices impact Willamette Valley soils, but we haven't been able to do it. And honestly, it's a little bit frustrating from a research standpoint that 6 decades of research into other systems don't seem to apply to grass seed cropping, but I do think that there's room for a little bit of improvement with our practices, and I hope you'll hear me out on this point. So I want to go back to this graph for a second, and I want you to see that there's some fields that are really on the low side, and these fields are in red. But there's also fields that are really high in carbon. And the question that I have, are these fields outliers? Are they just, super sequesters of soil carbon? Or is there some management practices that was used to grow crops in these soils that favored soil carbon storage? And can we implement those practices on other soils? Now, even these numbers in the middle have room for improvement, and it's something that we can aspire to for these numbers at the top. And we really need to know how to get there so that when carbon markets come around, we can use them to our advantage. So what do we need to do to get there? I'd like to propose some ideas. So in order to understand how we move the needle on carbon, we need to understand what's happening in these soils. To do that, we need long-term multi-location field studies. And we're trying to find funding for these studies right now. In other cropping systems, long-term studies have been extremely valuable in understanding how management practices influence soil health, productivity, and soil carbon, and I'm sure they would help us tease this system apart. We also need to be able to compare soils under grass seed to soils under other cultivation There are very few studies that have been done in other grasses, in row crops, in orchards, and those data are necessary to inform cap and trade or other carbon regulations. To make those comparisons, we really need standard methodology. When Martina did a literature review, she had a really hard time making comparisons between studies because different methodology was used. So we need standardization, and so when commissions fund studies, I hope they'll point to standard methodologies so that we can easily compare between studies. We recently received funding from our Office of National Programs to have a postdoc look at the impact of tile drainage on soil carbon. And because so many of our soils are artificially drained, we're really excited to see what this research yields. And lastly, we need to work more closely with growers to understand what they're doing to get these aspirational carbon stocks that I showed. This means putting out surveys and gathering data, and I'm hoping that our Canadian counterparts can help inform this. So thank you for your attention. Here's my contact information. I'll be around after the talk to answer any questions that you might have.
Awesome. Okay, so we're going to open it up for questions now for both presentations that you guys saw. So Franz or Maya, did you have something to ask?
The question that we have has to do with, they talk about carbon sequestering and that hasn't really changed much. But what about the soil tilth, the humus, I think is the word, that organic matter, sorry, from, that you get from incorporating your straw back into the soil?
So that's a great question. So I explained this a little bit at the beginning of the talk. At least in the soils in the Willamette Valley, when I'm talking about total carbon, I'm really talking about total organic carbon. We don't have a lot of inorganic carbon in our soils because our pH is pretty neutral, and so we don't see a big gain in organic carbon, and that would include things like humic acids. I'll also say that you bring up a really good point. So the carbon distribution does matter. So whether or not you have, what they call stable organic matter, whether or not you have more carbon that's associated with mineral fractions, which tends to be more stable, or whether you have really labile carbon that's circulated and consumed by microbes. So this is something we're looking at, is doing carbon partitioning in these soils to see how that matters. But yeah, but we don't have those data right now because when we did this study, we were just looking at total carbon. Does that make sense?
Did Nicole want to add anything?
Sure, I can add in. There is a little bit of data on that from Betsy Verhoeven's work, and also from some long-term annual ryegrass work where fields were looked at that have been, long-term baled versus long-term not. And generally, as Kristen mentioned, we don't seem to be able to change the percent organic matter from those management practices. So as Kristen mentioned, long-term trials could be really useful here because maybe it changes over super long periods of time. But, some of these tall fescue fields that we've gone into or that Betsy went into are, 10 plus years old, and we really just don't see that needle move. Definitely not very fast.
Okay, we have a question in the chat from Barat. So we are having similar problems on finding effects of management intervention on soil organic carbon change. So I guess he's got two questions. One, is bale removed from the field or they remain in the same field? And two, was the bulk density measured in the same soil core that was used for the soil organic carbon determination?
I'm not sure that I really understand the first question. Nicole, can you help me with that?
Yeah, I think so. So baling is, so we'll bale all of the straw after the seed comes off. It's put into stacks and then it's hauled and exported out of the US. So it's total removal of the straw from the field. And its straw loads depend on varieties and how much is there, but you're typically could be looking at an average of around 2 tons an acre in our system.
And then, yes, for the second question, we did measure bulk density in the same core that was used for organic carbon determination.
So do you use a square core or a round core?
We used a round core.
Do a round core. All right. Danny, you had put your hand up earlier.
Yeah, I said, thank you, Oregon, for doing the work you're doing. And we're starting to get into this work. And I'm sure glad that, not that I want to embarrass any scientists in Canada, but I'm sure glad that you guys are going, thinking deeper than 6 inches. And it proves my point that forage seed production or forages in general go to 1 meter deep. I'm totally surprised. And I hope that across North America, that the groups that are starting to push for carbon payments or carbon, whatever you want to call it, which carbon is not a good word in Canada around any farmer, I'm sure, or 95% of them. Kudos for taking that on. I think that's why I'm pushing a lot, but we got to go deeper than 6 inches. We can't go on the canola and the wheat depths at 6 inches when we're farming at 4 inches deep with zero till. So congratulations on that. My other comment I have is, did you do any tests on burnt fields of straw? Because am I right in saying if you burn a field, you're left with the carbon residue? Would that increase anything? Just food for thought.
So so field burning isn't very common down here any longer. We do still burn some of the fine fescue fields, but we don't have any fields down in tall fescue that are consistently burned. I do a lot of work with charcoal. And so I do think that, and when you dig into these soils, you can find a lot of natural charcoal from the decades we did a field burning. But yeah, we didn't look directly at any burned fields. It would be fun to. I would love to get a burn permit. And
yeah, so I'll just add in there a little bit, Danny. We were trying to we chose tall fescue because it's the biggest acre grass species in Oregon, and because either whether it's taxes on carbon or whether it's credits for sequestration, we were trying to hit something that covered the most ground. So of course you could do this on all these different species, but Kristen, one just follow-up question on Danny is, would field burning recycle all the carbon back onto the soil, or would you lose some in the burning process?
You lose a substantial amount. So it's not completely combusted, obviously, and that's why you get a lot of charcoal. Otherwise, you would just have ash on your ground. But I don't know what percentage is gained. I've heard people say something like 6% to 10% of the carbon. It burns pretty hot and quick, and so a lot of it goes up in the atmosphere.
And are a lot of any growers getting paid for carbon capture in Oregon? No.
Not that I'm aware of. I mean,
it's not come yet. I think what's happening in more locally here, Danny, in Oregon, is there's discussion of what they're calling cap and trade, which is going to be a tax for basically all your carbon emissions. And so the growers are basically trying to make the argument that they are actually playing a major role in carbon storage, and that should be credited towards sort of their bank account and their carbon account. And then there is some conversation like at the national level about, whether there are like practices that could be rewarded for, carbon storage or, however, doing something good for carbon. But really right now here locally in Oregon, the growers want to have some data that shows what they are actually storing. And then their hope is if there are tax programs that come in, that their storage would be taken into account in that taxation system.
And I think that's one of the reasons that we need to really quantify carbon across these different cropping systems, because, for example, if you move into hazelnuts, which a lot of fields are being turned over into, you're not putting all of that root biomass into the ground. And so is there a carbon sort of benefit to staying in grass? And I think understanding that is really key for decision making going forward, especially if something like cap and trade is passed.
I have a hypothesis that we're going to make our governments go broke, because I really think that we're storing more carbon than what we're realizing that they can pay for. But yeah, good job, you guys. Thanks.
Brat raised his hand, and then I think we'll go on to if there's any questions for Calvin after.
Thank you, Talon. It's great presentation, Christine. Thank you. My question regarding this bale removal is we are having some issues like when bales are removed, we are moving out lots of possible litter input. So in the long run, perhaps we are losing carbon from the system. So doesn't it may affect in the long run that we will be depleting carbon from the system?
You bring up a really good point. Some of these fields have been baled for 20 years and we can't capture differences in carbon. So part of it could be that, once you start baling, you build up a microbial community that turns over that straw really quickly. And I would say that in my casual observations, I've seen that where I go out to the field the next spring and I don't see a lot of residue left on the fields. And so that's part of it. I will say that, this is more of a story than just carbon, right? We're talking about a story about nutrients. We're talking about a story about economics of baling. And so I don't know that we can make it exactly about carbon. There's like a whole rubric that you should go through when you're deciding whether or not to bale your fields. And this is just part of that puzzle.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Great. Is there? Thank you so much, Kristen and Nicole, for joining us. And feel free to stay on. And I just wanted to check and see if there was any questions about Calvin's presentation, and then we can. He does a really good job of explaining everything. Okay, are there any further questions then for Nicole and Kristen? Okay, well, thank you guys all so much for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time to do the presentation and look forward to potential collaborations as we move forward. Okay, so I think that brings us to the end. I'm going to invite Danny to come back. And so while the presentations were going, Susie and I did, Susie actually put all the growers' names into the draw. And we did have a winner for the $800 Snap-on gift certificate, and it's Merlin Juneau. So congratulations, Merlin, for that. So what I will do is I can actually just put your information right into the, I can order the gift certificate right online. So now that I have a name to attach to it, we can get that going, but congratulations. And again, that Snap-on gift card comes from Foster Seed and Feed, Brett Young, and DLF More Seeds. So thank you so much to the industry that sponsors that. And I think that the other thing that we wanted to bring up was we also wanted to give a shout out to the BC chapter of the Canadian Seed Growers. So they've just recently closed the BC chapter and joined the Alberta Seed Growers. And in doing so, when they shut down operations, they actually donated $20,000 to the Peace Region Forage Seed Association for just as an investment into the research work that we've been doing. And so we really wanted to thank them for that donation. Is there anything that you wanted to say, Danny?
Yeah, that's pretty substantial. They didn't have that big account, bank account, but they put quite a bit of funding into organization. So thank you to all the BC growers, not just the pedigreed seed growers. But I don't think we have it in our budget yet. We will make it in good use, I'm sure. There's a lot of different things in BC compared to what there is in Alberta. I can think of two right now, just off the top of my head. One is weather monitoring stations. Another one is bugs and insects. So yeah, I think you need a big thank you to them guys. Thank you very much. I am wondering if we would be in person, we would be able to go sit down and have a coffee or fermented grape juice or something. And I'd just like to take another 15 minutes before we shut down and maybe shut the recording off. If anybody has any advice or any ideas or just a BS session on how we can improve our association, be it members or be it the whole association, if we can take 15 minutes, if there's any questions. If there's not, we'll go from there. If that's okay with you, Dallin. So yeah, we'll shut the recording off, and thank you for everybody coming.